A Ugandan priest refused to baptize a cartel leader's child and disappeared after Mass. His body turned up in a mass grave of 13. Some died inside their own churches. One led a 30,000-person peace march and was shot 6 weeks later. Section 1. Father John Senyondo. John Senyondo was born on December 25, 1959, in the Masaka district of Uganda, a country in East Africa where the Catholic Church had deep roots and where training young men for the priesthood had been a serious and well-organized enterprise for generations. He was ordained a priest in August of 1991 at 33 years old and became a member of the Comboni Missionaries of the Heart of Jesus, an order founded in the 19th century specifically to send priests into some of the most remote and underserved communities on earth. The Comboni missionaries had a long history of working in Africa, but by the time Senyondo joined their ranks, the order operated across multiple continents, going where ordinary parish infrastructure hadn't yet reached, or where poverty and violence had driven other institutions away. Senyondo spent more than a decade working in Comboni missions before a quieter but significant shift took place around 2007, when he formally requested what the Catholic Church calls incardination into a local diocese, essentially transferring his permanent allegiance from the missionary order to a specific regional church. The diocese he chose was Chilpancingo Chilapa, in the southern Mexican state of Guerrero. By 2010, he was back in Mexico, no longer as a visiting missionary, but as a permanent member of that diocese's clergy, committed to the people of one of the poorest and most violent corners of the country. He was 50 years old. He had left Uganda, left the structure and community of the Comboni order, and planted himself in a state where, in 2013 alone, the homicide rate per 100,000 residents was the highest of any state in Mexico. Guerrero occupies a strange place in the Mexican imagination. It contains Acapulco, once one of the most famous resort cities in the world, a place where Hollywood celebrities vacationed and where the cliffs of La Quebrada have drawn tourists for nearly a century. But away from the coastline, inland and into the mountains, Guerrero is a different country entirely. It is home to some of Mexico's most isolated indigenous communities, where people had historically survived by growing corn, beans, and opium poppies, the latter crop because there was simply no other crop that reliably brought in enough money to live on in communities with no paved roads, no reliable electricity, and no access to most government services. The poppy fields that dotted Guerrero's mountains were the foundation on which heroin trafficking had been built in the region for decades, and by the time Father Senyondo arrived, multiple competing criminal organizations were fighting for control of those fields and the smuggling routes that ran north from them toward the United States border. The Guerreros Unidos, the Ardillos, La Familia Michoacana, and various smaller armed groups moved through the diocese of Chilpancingo Chilapa with a level of territorial authority that in many communities exceeded anything the official government could claim. They taxed farmers, controlled roads, and in some areas dictated the terms under which local institutions, including churches, were allowed to operate. Priests who worked in these communities did so with an awareness, rarely spoken aloud, that they were functioning inside a parallel order of power that answered to no law except its own. Father Senyondo settled first in the town of Santa Cruz, in the municipality of Chilapa, a rural area about 35 minutes east of the state capital, Chilpancingo. He later transferred to the town of Nejapa, where he served as the parish priest. The diocese of Chilpancingo Chilapa covered a stretch of territory that included communities most Mexicans in the capital had never heard of, and that most government officials had never visited. For a priest working in that environment, daily life involved long drives on unpaved roads, celebrating Mass in communities with no other access to the sacraments, baptizing children, blessing marriages, burying the dead, and doing the patient, ordinary work of a parish priest in a place where the nearest hospital might be hours away and where the local authority most likely to respond quickly to any problem was not the police, but whoever controlled the surrounding territory on behalf of the cartel. Father Senondo understood this. Everyone who lived and worked in that part of Guerrero understood it. The question for a priest was always how to navigate that reality without either collaborating with it or being destroyed by it. The Catholic Church in Mexico has never had a single, unified answer to that question. Some bishops have chosen dialogue, meeting with cartel leaders personally and negotiating informal understandings that allowed their priests to work. Others have taken a harder public stance, preaching openly against cartel violence and accepting the risk that came with it. Bishop Salvador Rangel Mendoza, who became the Bishop of Chilpancingo, Chilapa in 2015, became famous in Mexico for his willingness to sit down with cartel bosses personally, driving deep into the mountains to have meals with men whose organizations were responsible for hundreds of murders. He was explicit about why. After Father Senondo's death, Rangel implemented a specific policy change in his diocese regarding the sacrament of baptism. He told priests under his authority that the witness for a baptism could be of any religion, any ideology, adding plainly that of course they are not the best witnesses, but there has to be a witness. The policy shift came directly from what had happened to Senondo and from Rangel's own uncomfortable calculation that enforcing strict canonical rules about the fitness of godparents was, in the specific conditions of Guerrero, potentially a death sentence for the priest doing the enforcing. What happened to Father Senondo on April 30th, 2014, began with an ordinary act of ministry. He had traveled that day into the rural mountains of the diocese to celebrate a wedding mass for a community in the area of Santa Cruz. Accounts of the events that followed have come primarily through local sources in Guerrero, later confirmed by the diocese and by reporting from Catholic news agencies. According to Bishop Rangel, who later spoke publicly about the case and whose account has been consistent with what local parishioners and diocesan officials described, someone at the gathering that day asked Father Senondo to perform a baptism. The person requesting the baptism was connected to a local criminal group operating in the area, and the individual they proposed as a godparent was a local village leader with criminal ties. According to the bishop's account, Senondo refused. His reason was straightforward and canonical. The proposed godparent did not meet the criteria the Church requires of a person standing as a baptismal sponsor. Rangel, describing the incident years later to Catholic News Service, framed it as a principled application of Church rules, the kind of decision a conscientious priest was supposed to make. Senondo had not done something reckless or political. He had simply done his job, applied the Church's own standards, and told the people asking that the baptism couldn't proceed under those conditions. In Guerrero in 2014, that answer was enough to get a man killed. The Vicar General of the Chilpancingo Chilapa Diocese, Father Victor Manuel Aguilar, confirmed in interviews following Senondo's disappearance that the priest had previously refused to pay an extortion demand from local criminals who believed, because he was a foreign priest, that he must be receiving significant funds from abroad. That prior refusal had already marked him in the eyes of whoever controlled the territory around his parish. A year before his disappearance, his home had been broken into by a criminal gang that left him tied up on the floor while they took his vehicle and household goods. He had survived that encounter. He had stayed. He had not asked to be transferred. He had continued driving the rural roads of Guerrero alone, celebrating Mass in mountain communities, performing the sacraments his parishioners needed, and saying no to the people who kept testing the boundary between what the Church would give and what it would refuse. When he left the wedding celebration on April 30th, a group of armed men in an SUV were waiting on the road. They blocked his vehicle. They took him from it. From that moment, Father John Senyondo disappeared from the public record entirely, as completely as if he had never been there. The diocese launched prayers. A campaign began in mid-May, asking parishioners across the diocese to pray for his safe return. But there were no leads made public, no demands for ransom, no communication of any kind from the people who had taken him. The Mexican State Attorney General's office confirmed he had been reported missing. Beyond that, official Mexico offered nothing. The city of Chilapa issued no public statement demanding investigation. The church itself, by multiple accounts of people close to the case, stayed largely quiet, passing information about what had happened in cautious, anonymous channels rather than loud public demands for accountability. The silence lasted 6 months. In late October 2014, federal police, searching the mountains of Guerrero for an entirely different set of victims, the 43 student teachers from the Ayotzinapa Rural Teachers College who had been abducted and disappeared on September 26th, stumbled upon a clandestine grave near the town of Ocotitlan. The discovery of that grave, which contained 13 sets of human remains, was reported November 2nd, 2014. It was a grim and chaotic period in Guerrero. The state was saturated with search operations, grief, and international press attention because of the missing students, whose disappearance had already become one of the worst human rights scandals in Mexican history. Among the 13 people whose remains were found in that grave was Father John Senyondo. He was 54 years old. His identification took time. The body found in the grave was not intact, and standard visual identification was not possible. The Forensic Medical Service of Guerrero, known in Mexico as SEMEFO, made the match using dental records. Father Senyondo had been receiving dental work in the period before his disappearance, and his dentist had kept the dental impressions created for that work. Those impressions were compared against the remains found in the grave, and the match was confirmed on November 13th, 2014, 2 weeks after the body was first discovered. The diocese was notified that same day. The cause of death, as confirmed by authorities and reported through multiple Catholic news agencies and local Mexican outlets, was a gunshot wound to the head. The Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, where Senyondo had studied and earned a master's degree and a divinity degree in 1991, later described him as one of several authentic martyrs among its alumni, a native of Uganda who had ministered to persecuted indigenous peoples in the Diocese of Chilpancingo Chilapa. The Comboni Superior General in Rome, Father Enrique Sanchez, wrote to the provincial leadership in Uganda and to Senyondo's family in Masaka, expressing the congregation's grief. The Superior General's letter acknowledged that for several months they had followed with attention and anxiety what had happened to their former member. Father Rogelio Busto Juarez, the superior of the Comboni Order in Mexico, speaking to reporters after the identification was confirmed, said plainly, "That is the risk we all run." It was not bravado. It was a straightforward description of what it meant to serve as a Catholic priest in Guerrero in 2014. In Uganda, a mass was celebrated at Father Senyondo's family home in Masaka on November 19, 2014, attended by Comboni missionaries and priests from the Masaka diocese. His elderly mother was there. His sister was there. Father Sylvester Hategekimana, who headed the Comboni mission in Uganda and attended the Mass, later described the gathering to reporters from the BBC and Catholic news agencies. He said the celebration was characterized by a witness of deep faith and an extraordinary understanding shown by his elderly mother and his sister. Two women sitting in a house in Masaka, receiving the news that the man they had watched become a priest, the man who had crossed 2 continents to serve a mountain community in southern Mexico, had been found in a mass grave 6 months after his disappearance, killed by a single bullet to the head. Father Hategekimana noted that Senyondo had become the 3rd Ugandan Comboni missionary to die in the line of duty, bringing the total number of Comboni missionaries worldwide who had died for their faith to 27. Nobody was ever publicly charged with Father Senyondo's murder. The state of Guerrero, which was at that moment struggling to account for the deaths of 43 students whose case had drawn international condemnation, did not make the killing of the Ugandan priest a priority. The Diocese of Chilpancingo Chilapa, which had the most to gain from demanding accountability, continued its policy of quiet navigation rather than loud confrontation with the cartel forces that controlled the territory where its priests worked. Bishop Rangel, when he arrived in the diocese in 2015 and inherited the aftermath of what had happened to Senyondo, drew the lesson that enforcing strict sacramental rules in a region controlled by armed groups was a luxury that could cost a priest his life, and he adjusted policy accordingly. That adjustment was, by his own explanation, a direct response to Senyondo's death. The bishop was essentially acknowledging that the church had decided it could not afford to have another priest killed over a baptism refusal, and so the rules around baptism would bend. What makes Father Senyondo's story sit differently from many others is the combination of elements that defined it. A man who had traveled from Uganda to one of Mexico's most dangerous states, not because he was assigned there, but because he had specifically asked to stay, who had already survived one robbery and refused one extortion demand, who then said no a second time to a request that must have felt, in the moment, like a routine application of church law, and who was dead within hours of that refusal, his body not found for 6 months, his killers never identified, his name added quietly to a list maintained by a Catholic media organization that tracks the deaths of priests in countries where holding a collar offers no protection at all. The Comboni missionaries called him a martyr. The Mexican state called him a missing person case that was eventually resolved. The men who killed him were never called anything. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the mountains of Guerrero, where a Ugandan missionary's refusal echoed long after he was gone, the story moves north to the Sierra Tarahumara of Chihuahua, where 2 elderly Jesuits, who had spent decades building a life among the same mountain communities they served, were shot dead inside their own church after refusing to hand over a man who had come to them for protection. Section 2. Father Javier Campos Morales and Father Joaquin Cesar Mora Salazar. Javier Campos Morales was born on February 13, 1943, in Mexico City, though he grew up in Monterrey, in the northern state of Nuevo León. At 16 years old, in August of 1959, he made a decision that would define the next 60 years of his life. He entered the Society of Jesus, the religious order known worldwide as the Jesuits, founded in the 16th century and historically associated with education, missionary work, and a willingness to go to the hardest places. He was ordained a priest on June 8, 1972, in Mexico City. 1 year later, in 1973, he made his first trip into the Sierra Tarahumara, the mountain range in the state of Chihuahua that cuts through some of the most rugged and remote terrain in all of North America. He would not really leave. The Sierra Tarahumara became his world. The Raramuri people who lived there became his parishioners, and the small town of Cerro Cahui, in the deep canyon country of the municipality of Urique, became something close to home. By the time he was killed in 2022, Father Campos had spent nearly 50 years in those mountains, moving between communities, learning the language, baptizing the children, burying the dead, and doing the quiet, persistent work that constitutes a missionary priest's entire existence. His parishioners called him El Gallo, the rooster, because of his famous talent for imitating the sound of a rooster crowing, a small detail that somehow captured everything people remembered about him, a man with enough lightness in him to make people laugh in a place that did not always offer much to laugh about. Joaquín César Mora Salazar was born on August 28, 1941, also in Monterrey, and entered the Jesuits in July of 1958, roughly a year before Campos did, at the same age of 16. He was ordained on May 1, 1971, and began his own long connection to the Sierra Tarahumara in 1976, when he first worked in the community of Sisoguchi. He served in various capacities across the region over the following decades, including a stretch in the 1990s working in Chiapas before returning to Chihuahua. From 2007 onward, he served as cooperating vicar in Sirocahui, working alongside Campos in the parish that would be the setting for both their deaths. His parishioners called him El Morita, a term of affection that pointed to how quietly and without pretense he moved through his work. One man who had known him for years described him later as the most silent of all the Jesuits he had ever had the fortune of meeting, a priest who never displayed luxury of any kind and gave away everything he possessed to those who had less. Together, Campos and Mora had been Jesuit priests for a combined total approaching a century. They had outlasted cartel leaders, Mexican presidents, and 5 decades of Sierra Tarahumara winters. In June of 2022, they were 79 and 80 years old respectively, and they were still there. To understand what happened to them, it is necessary to understand what the Sierra Tarahumara had become by that point. The mountains of Chihuahua had always been a place where central government authority thinned out and then largely disappeared. The terrain is spectacular, the canyons as deep as the Grand Canyon in some places, the roads unpaved and seasonal, the distances between towns measured not in kilometers, but in walking days. The Raramuri people, one of Mexico's largest indigenous groups, had survived in these mountains for centuries, partly by retreating deeper into them whenever outside forces threatened to disrupt their way of life. Their communities were exactly the kind of places that criminal organizations understood as exploitable. Opium poppies grew well in the foothills, marijuana did too, and the remoteness that had always protected the Raramuri from interference also protected anyone who wanted to run a trafficking operation without federal oversight. By 2022, the dominant criminal presence across most of the Sierra Tarahumara was a faction called Los Salazar, an arm of the broader Sinaloa cartel operating in alliance with a group known internally as Gente Nueva. Their local leader in the municipality of Urique and the surrounding canyon communities was a man named José Noriel Portillo Gil, who went by the nickname El Chueco, meaning the Crooked One. He was approximately 30 years old. He had begun as a poppy farmer on land his family owned, graduated into working for other Sinaloa cartel bosses, killed his way up through the local hierarchy, and by his mid-20s was running more than 20 small towns across a vast stretch of the Sierra Madre Mountains, controlling drug trafficking, illegal logging, and the collection of what the cartels call piso, the extortion fee charged to anyone operating a business, including churches, within their territory. People who lived under his control later described him to journalists as someone who killed for any reason and no reason, a man so unpredictable that his own name was not spoken aloud in public in the communities he ruled. In the years before June of 2022, El Chueco had accumulated a serious legal history that the state had done nothing to act on. He was wanted since 2018 for the murder of Patrick Braxton Andrew, an American Spanish teacher from North Carolina who had been hiking in the Tarahumara Mountains and was killed, apparently because El Chueco or people around him suspected the man was an undercover DEA agent, a suspicion that was completely without basis. The murder of an American citizen should have brought serious federal pressure. It did not, or at least not enough to remove El Chueco from the territory he controlled. He kept running his operations. He kept driving through Sirocahui and the surrounding towns in modern vehicles, sometimes armored, fully visible to the local population, maintaining his grip on the region without any meaningful interference from the state or federal governments that were nominally responsible for law enforcement in the area. President López Obrador's government had adopted a security policy popularly described as hugs, not bullets, a deliberate decision not to pursue direct military confrontations with cartel leadership. For communities like Sirokawi, that policy translated into life under El Chueco, who by all accounts interpreted the absence of aggressive enforcement as permission to operate exactly as he pleased. On June 20th, 2022, El Chueco's behavior that day was driven by a cascade of violence that had nothing to do with drugs or trafficking routes. The immediate trigger was a baseball game. El Chueco was the sponsor of Sirokawi's official baseball team, a way of publicly displaying his local authority and buying the loyalty of young men in the community. During the game, a dispute broke out over a metal bat. The rules of the competition required wooden bats only, but Sirokawi's team, under El Chueco's influence, had used a metal bat. Two brothers from the opposing team, Paul Osvaldo Bereleza Rabago and his brother Armando, confronted the situation. That confrontation triggered El Chueco's rage. At noon, he and his armed men arrived at the home of the Bereleza brothers, kidnapped them, and burned the house down. One brother managed to escape. Paul Osvaldo did not. Shortly after that, near a small hotel in the center of Sirokawi, El Chueco encountered Pedro Eliodoro Palma Gutierrez, a 60-year-old local tour guide who was present at or near the hotel where tourists were staying. According to multiple accounts of what happened, El Chueco attacked Palma, wounding him. Palma, bleeding and desperate, ran. He ran in the direction of the nearest place he believed offered any protection at all: the San Francisco Javier Church, the Jesuit parish that Father Javier Campos and Father Joaquin Mora had been serving for decades. The heart of their community, the building where they had baptized children and buried the old, and stood in front of their congregation Sunday after Sunday for combined decades of uninterrupted service. Palma stumbled through the church doors and collapsed inside. At 1:25 in the afternoon, on June 20th, El Chueco followed him in. What happened in the next minutes inside the San Francisco Javier Church was witnessed by at least one other Jesuit priest who was present, Father Jesus Reyes, who survived the attack without being shot and who later described the moment to reporters. He said he could almost feel the bullets going through his own body. He described standing at the altar with his two colleagues beside him, watching an armed man walk into their church, and he asked El Chueco not to take the bodies of Campos and Mora after the shooting. El Chueco ignored that request. Fathers Campos and Mora, 79 and 80 years old, stood between Pedro Palma and the man who wanted to kill him. According to accounts from the Jesuit provincial in Mexico, Father Luis Gerardo Moro Madrid, the two priests tried to protect the wounded man and attempted to calm the gunman. El Chueco shot all three of them. Then, as his men waited outside with vehicles, he had the bodies of the two Jesuit priests loaded into a truck and driven out of Sirokawi. The man who had killed them left the church with their remains, leaving Father Reyes alive behind the altar and Father Palma dead on the church floor. The first call to emergency services, reporting 3 killings at the San Francisco Javier Church, came at 6 in the evening on June 20th. By then, El Chueco and the bodies were gone. The Jesuits of Mexico released a statement the following day, confirming the deaths and demanding justice and the recovery of the bodies of their brothers, who were taken from the church by armed persons. The Mexican government mobilized more than 2,500 security personnel, including army units, the National Guard, and state police from Chihuahua. Governor Maria Eugenia Campos announced on June 22nd that the bodies of Fathers Javier Campos and Joaquin Mora, along with the remains of tour guide Pedro Palma, had been located and recovered. Forensic experts confirmed their identities. The bodies had been removed from Sirokawi and dumped on a road approximately 120 miles away. The State Attorney General's office announced a reward of 5 million pesos, roughly $250,000, for information leading to El Chueco's capture. Officials described it as the highest reward ever offered in the state's history. The manhunt lasted 9 months. During that time, El Chueco continued operating in the Sierra Tarahumara with a degree of freedom that horrified the communities living under his control and baffled the national press. He released a video in August of 2022 denying direct responsibility for the church murders and using it to threaten Father Jesus Reyes, the priest who had survived the attack. After that threat, Reyes began moving through his pastoral work with a military escort. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the IACA, issued precautionary measures in January of 2023, protecting 12 members of the Jesuit community in the Sierra Tarahumara, 3 of them nuns and 9 of them priests, all of whom the commission determined faced a serious, urgent, and irreparable risk to their safety, given the ongoing impunity surrounding El Chueco's continued freedom. By that point, 32 people connected to his organization had been arrested in connection with the June events, but El Chueco himself remained at large in the mountains that had been his base for years. He was found dead on March 18, 2023. His body turned up on a dirt road between 2 small communities in the municipality of Xua, in the state of Sinaloa, near the border with Chihuahua. He had been shot in the head. 16 spent shell casings were found near the body. His sister traveled to Sinaloa to view the remains and identified him by sight. DNA testing later confirmed the identification officially. President López Obrador announced the confirmation publicly. The circumstances of his death were never fully established by authorities. No firefight had been reported by local residents. No military operation was announced in connection with the location where he died. The evidence at the scene pointed toward an execution carried out quietly, without witnesses, in a remote location. Mexican authorities connected to the investigation said privately that his death had come after he was summoned to a meeting with Gente Nueva criminal leadership in Sinaloa, suggesting El Chueco had been killed by his own organization, likely because the pressure his actions had brought down on the wider Sinaloa cartel structure in Chihuahua had become bad for business. The Jesuits of Mexico responded to the news of his death with a statement that rejected any interpretation of it as justice. They said that the mere fact that Portillo Gil had been shot to death could in no way be considered a triumph for justice or a solution to the structural problem of violence in the mountainous Sierra Tarahumara region. The lack of a legal process, they said, only confirmed that the Mexican government had failed in its basic duties and had not managed to bring control to the territory. What the Jesuits wanted, and what they did not get, was a trial, a public accounting, a formal record of what happened inside their church on June 20th, 2022, with a defendant in a courtroom and a judge reading a verdict. Instead, El Chueco was executed somewhere in the mountains between Sinaloa and Chihuahua by people who were never identified, for reasons that were never officially confirmed, and the cases connected to his name, including the murders of 2 elderly priests, remained officially open, with no defendant to stand trial for them. The Jesuit order announced after El Chueco's death that it would not be closing its mission in Cerro. The priests who remained in the Sierra Tarahumara continued their work. Father Reyes stayed in Cerro. The Raramuri communities that Campos and Mora had served for more than 2 decades between them still needed someone to celebrate Mass, and the Jesuits had been in those mountains for long enough that leaving was not something they were willing to consider. Multiple priests and missionaries who spoke to journalists in the months after the killings described the same reasoning, that withdrawing because of violence would abandon exactly the people they were there to serve, the people with the fewest options and the least protection of anyone in the region. Jesus Vega, a Raramuri man from the town of Cuiteco, who had grown up around Father Campos, told a reporter that El Gallo had taught him how to play the guitar. When he died, Vega said, he felt very sad. Father Campos had baptized children, confirmed grandchildren, fixed televisions, taught carpentry, and made the sound of a rooster for the benefit of anyone who needed to laugh. He had been in those mountains for nearly 50 years. He was buried far from Seracahui, far from the canyons where he had spent his priesthood, and the man who shot him in his own church was never brought before a court. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the canyon country of Chihuahua, where two elderly priests died standing between a gunman and the man who had run to them for help, the story moves south to Chiapas, where an indigenous Tzotzil priest spent 2 decades building an opposition movement against cartel control of his home state, and was shot on his way to a second mass on an ordinary Sunday morning. Section 3. Father Marcelo Perez. Marcelo Perez Perez was born on January 17, 1974, in San Andres Larainsar, a Tzotzil Maya township in the highlands of Chiapas, Mexico's southernmost and poorest state. His parents were indigenous Tzotzil peasants, farmers whose daily existence was shaped by the cycles of corn planting and harvest, and by the Catholic faith that had wound itself through Tzotzil community life across generations. He was religious from childhood, drawn to the church with a seriousness that his community noticed early. Felipe Arizmendi Esquivel, who was then the bishop responsible for Chiapas, encouraged the young man toward the priesthood, and in 1990, at 16 years old, Marcelo Perez entered the Our Lady of Guadalupe Seminary in the Archdiocese of Tuxtla Gutierrez, beginning the long formation process that would end with his ordination. He was ordained a priest on April 6, 2002, by the cardinal who had first encouraged him. He was 28 years old, and he went almost immediately into some of the most complicated terrain the Diocese of San Cristobal de las Casas had to offer. His first major assignment sent him to the municipality of Chenalho, a name already freighted with grief in the Chiapas highlands. Chenalho was the site of the Actial massacre of December 22, 1997, when a paramilitary group attacked a group of pacifist Catholic believers known as Las Abejas, meaning the bees, who had gathered in a small community to pray and fast. 45 people were killed, among them pregnant women and children, in a killing that bore all the marks of a planned, organized attack with roots in the political violence between indigenous communities that the Mexican state had both stoked and failed to contain for years. By the time Father Perez arrived in Chenalho, the massacre was 5 years past, but never truly over. Survivors still carried what they had witnessed. The community remained fractured. The wounds from 1997 had not healed, and in many ways could not heal, because the broader conditions that had produced the massacre, poverty, political manipulation, the breakdown of community governance, and the growing presence of armed groups, had not changed. Father Perez spent 8 years there. People who knew him during that period described how he transformed as a priest in that environment, shifting from caution to outspokenness, from a reserved young clergyman to someone who spoke directly against alcohol abuse, against drug dealing, against the presence of criminal groups in his community. He went, in the words of one woman who knew him in Chenalho, from being a rabbit to being a lion. The transformation cost him almost immediately. After he campaigned against a government plan that would have forcibly resettled displaced indigenous people into a government-designed model village, his parish house was set on fire. Later, 2 men attacked and beat him in the street. The diocese, fearing for his safety, transferred him in 2011 to Simojovel, a municipality about 30 miles north of San Cristobal de las Casas, a center of amber mining dominated by a local mestizo family whose grip on the town's economic and political life had been total for years. In Simojovel, Father Perez continued the same pattern. He organized, he denounced, he built relationships with indigenous communities, fighting for their land and their rights. By 2014, his parish in Simojovel had begun loudly calling out the increase in drug sales and the arrival of criminal groups in the area, and the death threats that followed became serious enough that in 2015, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights issued formal precautionary measures in his name, a legal mechanism designed to demand that the Mexican state take specific steps to protect his life. Those measures would remain in place for the rest of his life and would not save him. To understand what eventually killed Father Marcelo Perez, it is necessary to understand Pantello, a mountainous highland municipality not far from Chenalhó, where he had spent his first years as a priest. For more than 2 decades, Pantello had been controlled by a local family known as the Herreras, a clan that by every account, from people who lived there, ran the municipality through a combination of political office, hired gunmen, and a business portfolio that local journalists described as including drug trafficking, migrant smuggling, weapons sales, and car theft. The family's longtime patriarch, Ostraberto Herrera, had a reputation as someone who resolved all problems through violence. His son Daly would later end up in prison under suspicion of ordering the assassination of the very prosecutor who had been appointed to investigate violence in Pantello. A journalist who wrote extensively about the Herreras described their operation as one of the most entrenched examples of local criminal political power in all of Chiapas, a family that had held the municipality hostage for so long that the violence had become the normal condition of life there, something people endured rather than expected to escape. The situation broke open in the summer of 2021. On July 5th of that year, a man named Simón Pedro Pérez López, the president of Las Abejas de Acteal, the same pacifist community organization that had survived the 1997 massacre, was shot and killed. His death triggered a crisis. Indigenous community members in Pantello, exhausted by years of murder and forced silence, formed a self-defense group called El Machete and moved against the people they held responsible for the violence. On July 26, 2021, El Machete kidnapped 21 people it accused of being members of the Herrera criminal network. The Chiapas State Attorney General's office responded by issuing an arrest warrant for Father Marcelo Perez, claiming he had ties to the kidnappers. The warrant was never executed. Father Perez denied any connection to the kidnapping and said publicly that his work had always been and would only ever be oriented toward peace. The diocese stood behind him, but the unfounded warrant hung over him anyway, part of a pattern of using legal machinery to pressure and delegitimize people who got in the way of criminal political power. The diocese transferred him again in October 2021, this time to the Our Lady of Guadalupe parish in San Cristobal de las Casas, the diocesan seat, partly for his safety and partly to give him a broader platform from which to continue his work. He adapted without slowing down. From his new parish, he took on the role of coordinator of the diocese's social ministry, worked with multiple communities across the highlands, and kept organizing marches. By 2024, he had become the most visible Catholic voice, speaking publicly and without hedging about the cartel crisis in Chiapas. In a state where Sinaloa cartel forces and the Jalisco New Generation cartel had been fighting a savage territorial war for years, forcing thousands of residents to flee their homes and hundreds of communities across the highlands and border zones to choose sides or face violence, Father Perez kept going in the same direction, louder. In August of 2024, he gave an interview to a Chiapas news outlet in which he stated plainly that a price had been put on his life. He knew it. He said it out loud. He kept going. On September 13th, 2024, He helped organize and lead a pilgrimage for peace through Tuxtla Gutierrez, the state capital, in which 30,000 people marched. Standing before the crowd, he told reporters that in many communities and municipalities, violence was really unbearable. He described people dead, people displaced, people hiding in the mountains, and he called on the incoming president of Mexico and the incoming governor of Chiapas to take what he called an intelligent approach to dismantling the armed groups, rather than waiting for people to file complaints that nobody would respond to. He was speaking a month before his death. His assistant later recalled that in the weeks following the march, he seemed more concerned than ever about what was happening in Pantelio, telling her he kept receiving photographs of bodies in bags sent to him by people in the communities, trying to make sure someone outside knew what was happening. On Sunday, October 20th, 2024, Father Perez celebrated his first Mass of the morning at the church in the Cuxtitali neighborhood, on the edge of San Cristobal de las Casas. The last hurricane of the season had swept through the highlands, leaving behind a cold, damp morning. Mass ran a few minutes late. When it ended, parishioners filed out into the rain. Father Perez walked across the plaza toward his white Ford, parked on an adjacent street. He called his assistant on his phone while he got in. He told her he was leaving. He was coming to get her so they could go together to the Guadalupe church for the second Mass of the day. She was still on the phone with him when she heard the shots, then a scream, then an I, then nothing but the radio still transmitting in the empty truck. Two men on a motorcycle had pulled alongside his vehicle as he drove away from the church and opened fire. Father Marcelo Perez was 50 years old. He died from his wounds before any help reached him. The Chiapas State Prosecutor's Office moved quickly. Within 2 days, they announced the arrest of a suspect they identified only as Edgar, a local drug dealer, using security camera footage, witness accounts, and other investigative leads. That arrest moved through the judicial process faster than many observers expected, in a state where impunity had long been the standard response to political killings. On August 6, 2025, a federal judge in Chiapas issued a 20-year prison sentence against Edgar for the aggravated homicide of Father Marcelo Perez. The conviction covered the material perpetrator, meaning the man who physically carried out the killing. It did not cover whoever ordered it. In October of 2025, a second suspect, a man identified by the alias El Chesman, described as an alleged leader of a criminal group called Los Motonetos, was arrested in connection with the case. The investigation into who planned and ordered the killing of Father Perez, the intellectual authors in the language of Mexican criminal law, remained formally open as of the most recent reporting. Human rights organizations that had accompanied Father Perez since 2015 were direct about their concerns with how the conviction had been handled. The sentenced man had entered what Mexican courts call an abbreviated procedure, essentially admitting guilt in exchange for a reduced sentence without a full public trial. That meant the evidence gathered by prosecutors was never presented in open court, and the fuller picture of who was responsible for the killing and why was never publicly established. The Minerva Bello Center for the Rights of Victims of Violence, which had followed the judicial process, stated in response to the verdict that the murder was not an isolated incident, but part of a strategy of terror in a context of structural impunity that protected organized crime and networks of political and economic power. They accused the Mexican state of failing to guarantee truth and justice, and demanded an independent investigation that recognized the killing for what it was: a targeted murder of a human rights defender carried out in retaliation for his work. The people closest to Father Perez described losing not just a priest, but the most credible, stubborn, irreplaceable voice holding cartel violence up to public scrutiny in one of the most dangerous states in Mexico. Cardinal Felipe Arizmendi, the same man who had ordained him in 2002, and who attended the Mass for peace in his hometown after his burial, said in the days following the killing that the strategy of not confronting cartels had simply not worked, and that Mexico needed to stop pretending otherwise. He called on the incoming government to act. The diocesan statement described Father Marcelo as a tireless apostle of peace who had spent his life searching for justice, especially for the indigenous poor of Chiapas, and whose death not only deprived a community of a dedicated pastor, but silenced a prophetic voice that would not easily be replaced. At his funeral in San Andrés la Reinsar, the town where he was born, 2,000 mourners came. They lowered his coffin using ropes, by hand, into the ground of the church courtyard of his hometown parish. They chanted his name as the coffin went down. Viva Padre Marcelo, priest of the poor. Marcelo, friend, the people are with you. He had told them, in one of his last major public appearances, that peace is greater than death. They were still repeating it in the rain. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From Chiapas, where a priest who had marched 30,000 people for peace was shot leaving his own church, the story moves north into Guerrero, where a seminary teacher, who publicly accused one of Mexico's most feared cartel organizations by name, was kidnapped from his school on a Monday and found dead on Christmas Day. Section 4. Father Gregorio López Gorostieta, Ciudad Altamirano, sits at the edge of a region of Guerrero state called Tierra Caliente, a name that translates as hot land and that refers partly to the blistering climate of the low-lying valley where the town stands, and partly, by long local understanding, to everything else that made life difficult there. It is a place at the intersection of three states, Guerrero, Michoacán, and the state of Mexico, where the mountains of the Sierra Madre del Sur begin giving way to a drier, flatter landscape of citrus groves and cattle ranches, and, for decades, clandestine poppy fields that supplied the raw material for heroin moving north toward the United States border. The city itself was the seat of the Diocese of Ciudad Altamirano, a small Catholic diocese of 37 parishes stretched across one of the most violent corners of Mexico. By 2014, the diocese had already buried multiple priests over the previous 5 years. Armed men had shot 2 seminarians and a priest driving through the city in 2009. Another priest had been found dead in a river in September of 2014. The bishop of the diocese, Maximino Martinez Miranda, had been watching his clergy die one by one in a state where cartel violence had become so embedded in the structure of daily life that morgues in Guerrero's capital city of Chilpancingo had, by 2017, reported being unable to keep up with the volume of bodies arriving for autopsy. In December of 2014, it was the turn of a seminary teacher named Father Gregorio López Gorostieta. Almost nothing of Father López Gorostieta's early life appears in the public record beyond what was confirmed by his diocese after his death. What is known is that he was assigned to the seminary in Ciudad Altamirano as a teacher, that he was part of the diocesan clergy that served the Tierra Caliente region, and that by December 2014, he had become known as a priest who preached directly and without softening against the organized crime groups that controlled life in the area around him. His parishioners and students called him Goyito, an affectionate diminutive of Gregorio, to distinguish him from another priest named Gregorio López, based across the state border in Michoacán, who had become famous across Mexico for leading a self-defense movement against the Knights Templar cartel from inside the city of Apatzingán. The two men shared a name, a state, and a willingness to say in public what most people in positions of power were careful never to say aloud. When Goyito of Guerrero was killed, Goyo of Michoacán was among the first to speak out publicly about who was responsible. To understand the specific moment in which Father López Gorostieta died, It is necessary to understand what September 26, 2014, had done to Guerrero and to Mexico. On that night, in the city of Iguala, which sits in Guerrero, roughly 120 miles northeast of Ciudad Altamirano, police working in coordination with the local criminal organization Guerreros Unidos stopped several buses carrying students from the Ayotzinapa Rural Teachers College, a training school for rural educators that had a long history of left-wing student activism. What followed became one of the worst atrocities in recent Mexican history. 6 students were killed that night. 43 more disappeared. Their families were told they had been handed over to Guerreros Unidos by the police and never seen again. The Iguala mayor and his wife were arrested weeks later, accused of ordering the attack. Guerreros Unidos, the same criminal organization that controlled Ciudad Altamirano and the surrounding Tierra Caliente region, was identified by Mexican federal authorities as the group responsible for whatever had happened to the 43 students after the police handed them over. Guerreros Unidos had been established around 2011 as a splinter organization from the old Beltran Leyva cartel, finding its footing initially in the municipalities of Iguala, Taxco, and Ciudad Altamirano in Guerrero and Cuernavaca in the neighboring state of Morelos. By 2014, it had grown into a significant regional operation, moving drugs north through hidden compartments fitted into long-distance passenger buses and running extortion, kidnapping, and murder operations across a wide stretch of Guerrero and into adjoining states. The group had a documented relationship with the local municipal police in multiple towns, including Iguala, where the mayor's own administration was accused of functioning as a political and financial partner to the organization. When the Ayotzinapa crisis broke, the federal government deployed thousands of troops and police to Guerrero in the largest security operation the state had seen in years. On December 4th, Interior Minister Miguel Ángel Osorio Chong announced a special stepped-up security plan covering 22 municipalities in Guerrero, 2 in Michoacán, 8 in the state of Mexico, and 4 in Morelos. Ciudad Altamirano was explicitly included in that plan. The stated purpose was to restore the conditions for daily life without violence. The soldiers arrived, the security plan was announced, and within weeks, Father Lopez Gorostieta was dead. Accounts from people close to the case, later shared with local Catholic journalists and reported through church communications networks, described what happened in the days before he was taken. On Sunday, December 21st, 2014, Father Lopez Gorostieta had celebrated Mass at the cathedral in Ciudad Altamirano and then attended a pastorela, a traditional Christmas play of the kind performed across Mexico in the weeks before December 25th. Afterward, he returned to the seminary on the outskirts of the city where he both taught and lived. According to Bishop Martinez Miranda, a group of armed men had been observed in the area around the seminary on both Sunday and Monday, watching it, noting when the priest came and went. What local sources reported to news agencies covering the case was more specific. Father Lopez Gorostieta had preached that Sunday against the Guerreros Unidos cartel by name, directly accusing the organization in connection with the Ayotzinapa student disappearances. According to those accounts, he was taken within hours of that sermon. The priest from Michoacán with the similar name, Gregorio López Jerónimo, later confirmed this account publicly, stating in a message to local news agency Cuadratín that his colleague had been kidnapped in retaliation for accusing the Guerreros Unidos in his homily, and that the killing was the cartel's response to a priest who refused to stay silent about what it had done. The seminary raised the alarm quickly. Bishop Martinez Miranda went public with the kidnapping, appealing through Facebook and through every available media outlet for the armed men who had taken Father Lopez Gorostieta to release him unharmed. No contact came from the kidnappers, No ransom demand was communicated. No representative of the organization that had taken him reached out to the diocese or the family. This silence, in the context of how organized crime operates in Mexico, was itself a signal. Kidnappers who want money make contact. Men who take a priest because they want to send a message do not. The bishop organized a protest march through Ciudad Altamirano on December 24th, Christmas Eve, demanding the priest's return. Priests and parishioners walked through the city in the rain, joined by clergy from surrounding states. They carried signs, they prayed, they called for the people who had taken their colleague to release him. The march happened and the rain fell, and nobody released anyone. Father Lopez Gorostieta's truck was found abandoned 2 days after his abduction. It had been left on a road outside the city, doors closed, engine off, as if parked deliberately. There was no sign of struggle visible around the vehicle. There was no indication of where the priest had been taken or in which direction he had been moved. On Christmas Day, December 25th, 2014, at around 3 in the afternoon, his body was found near the town of Tlapehuala in the Tierra Caliente region on the stretch of federal highway that connects Ciudad Altamirano with the municipality of Arcelia. The body had been left on the road near a monument honoring a former Mexican president. He had been shot in the head. He also bore signs of torture, consistent with the accounts from local sources who described his death as an execution carried out after a period of captivity rather than a quick killing. His mouth and nose had been covered with tape, and at least one account from the time of discovery cited asphyxiation as the formal cause of death, though a gunshot wound to the head was also confirmed. The Diocese of Ciudad Altamirano posted a statement on the cathedral's Facebook page that same afternoon. The message said only that their brother, Gregorio Lopez Gorostieta, had departed for his father's house and expressed the hope that God would forgive whoever had committed such an abhorrent act. The killing hit Bishop Martinez Miranda with a weight that was both personal and institutional. In his public statement following the discovery of the body, he said that Father Lopez Gorostieta was another priest added to those who had died for their love of Christ. And then he added something more raw and direct. Enough already of so much pain, enough of so many murders, enough of this crime, enough of these extortions. It was the kind of language that the formal bureaucracy of the Catholic Church rarely used in official statements, and it captured something of the accumulated exhaustion of a diocese that had been watching its clergy die for years in a state where the people most responsible faced essentially no legal consequences. The Diocese of Ciudad Altamirano confirmed later that it was the 4th murder of a priest in 5 years for that single, small diocese of 37 parishes. Father Habacuc Hernandez Benitez and 2 seminarians had been shot dead while driving through the city in 2009. Father Ascension Acuña Osorio had been found floating in the Balsas River in late September 2014, with head wounds whose origin investigators declined to clarify publicly. And now, Father Lopez Gorostieta, kidnapped from his seminary on Christmas Eve and found on a highway on Christmas Day. Pope Francis responded publicly on January 1st, 2015, expressing what the Vatican described as deep sadness and extending condolences to the diocesan community of Ciudad Altamirano. He also urged the priests and missionaries of the diocese to continue their work with ardor despite the difficulties, pointing to Jesus as an example. The message was well-intentioned, and it was essentially all that Rome could offer from a practical standpoint. The cartel that had killed Father Lopez Gorostieta was not going to be addressed by a papal statement. The federal security operation that had been announced with considerable ceremony just weeks before his death had not prevented his kidnapping or his murder. Mexican authorities confirmed the priest had been reported missing, but offered no additional information even after his body was found. The bishop noted bitterly in his public statement that the same absence of follow-up had characterized the investigation into the September killing of Father Acuña Osorio. "The government investigates," he said, "and nothing is ever known." No suspects in Father López Gorostieta's murder were ever publicly identified. No arrests were made, no charges filed, no trial held. The case entered the same category of permanent, unresolved impunity that characterized the vast majority of violent crimes in Guerrero that year. A state where prosecutors were overwhelmed, courts were compromised, and the organizations responsible for the killings still controlled enough of the local political infrastructure that even naming them came with serious personal risk. The Guerreros Unidos, despite the enormous national pressure brought to bear on the organization in the wake of the Ayotzinapa crisis, remained operational in the Tierra Caliente region for years afterward. The federal security plan that was supposed to restore normal life to Ciudad Altamirano continued to operate in theory, while the conditions that had produced the killings of multiple priests over 5 years remained unchanged in practice. What lingers in Father López Gorostieta's story is the timing and the sequence. A priest who taught at a seminary, who was known to his students as Goyito, and who was not, by the existing record, a nationally prominent activist or a leader of marches or an organizer of self-defense movements, stood at an altar in Ciudad Altamirano on a Sunday in December of 2014, in the worst moment of crisis his state had experienced in living memory, and said by name the organization he believed was responsible. He was taken the same day. He was found dead on Christmas morning. The priest from Michoacán, with the same first name who spoke out loudest about his death, had been wearing a bulletproof vest to give his own homilies for months by that point, and had been publicly preparing for the possibility that what happened to Goyito might eventually happen to him too. It did not, as of this writing, though the conditions that produced both their stories have not meaningfully improved in the decades since. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From the Tierra Caliente of Guerrero, where a seminary teacher was taken hours after naming a cartel from his pulpit, the story moves back in time to 1993 and to the most prominent killing of a Catholic official in Mexican history, a cardinal shot dead at one of the country's largest airports in a killing whose full truth has never been publicly established and remains disputed more than 30 years later. Section 5. Cardinal Juan Jesús Posadas Ocampo. Juan Jesús Posadas Ocampo was born on November 10, 1926, in Salvatierra, a small city in the central Mexican state of Guanajuato, roughly 200 miles northwest of Mexico City. He was born into a country that was, at that moment, still working through the violent aftermath of the Cristero War, a 3-year conflict between the Mexican government and Catholics who had taken up arms in defense of the church after the government began enforcing fiercely anti-clerical laws in the 1920s. Approximately 90 priests had been killed in that war, and the legal and cultural suppression of the Catholic Church had continued in various forms through the 1930s, creating an environment in which a young man who felt called to the priesthood navigated considerable social and political resistance before ever reaching an altar. Posadas Ocampo discerned that vocation to the priesthood at around 11 years old, a calling that, in the anti-clerical climate of the 1930s, required patience and determination simply to pursue. He studied at the Seminario Conciliar in Morelia, where he eventually became a vice-rector and was ordained a priest on September 23, 1950, at 23 years old. He spent the first 2 decades of his priestly career in parish work and teaching in Morelia, before being elevated to bishop, serving first as Bishop of Tijuana from 1970 to 1982, and then as Bishop of Cuernavaca from 1982 to 1987. In May of 1987, he became Archbishop of Guadalajara, one of the largest and most influential dioceses in Mexico, presiding over the spiritual life of the country's second-largest city. On June 28, 1991, Pope John Paul II elevated him to the College of Cardinals, making him Cardinal Archbishop of Guadalajara, a role that placed him among the senior leadership of the Catholic Church in all of Latin America. By 1993, Cardinal Posadas Ocampo was 66 years old and had spent more than 4 decades in the Church. His 6 years as Archbishop of Guadalajara had coincided with a period of dramatic and destabilizing change in Mexico's drug landscape. The early 1990s were a moment of intense cartel realignment, with the major trafficking organizations that had operated with relative cohesion through the 1980s beginning to fracture and fight each other for control of the country's most valuable smuggling corridors. Two of the most powerful factions at that moment were the organization built by Joaquin Guzman Loera, known as El Chapo, which operated primarily out of Sinaloa, and the Arellano Felix family, who controlled operations out of Tijuana and whose organization would later be known worldwide as the Tijuana Cartel. These two groups were in open, violent conflict with each other in the early 1990s, fighting over Guadalajara and other key transit cities. The Jalisco state capital, which had been something of a neutral ground for major traffickers in the 1980s, was becoming contested territory. Shootings and assassinations were becoming more visible, more public, and less contained within the closed world of the cartels themselves. Guadalajara had not yet become the overtly militarized city it would become in later years, but anyone paying attention to the news could see the shape of what was building. Posadas Ocampo was paying attention. He had spent 6 years as Archbishop of a city where the cartel presence was becoming increasingly impossible to ignore, and he had used his pulpit to respond to what he saw. Researchers who later examined the record of his public ministry in Guadalajara documented more than 40 sermons and public messages in which he directly criticized drug trafficking, calling it a grave moral evil and highlighting what he described as the grave responsibility and deterioration that cartels brought to Mexican society. He portrayed narco-trafficking not just as a legal or enforcement problem, but as a spiritual and communal one, an illness that corrupted institutions, exploited the vulnerable, and corroded the social fabric of a country whose people the Church was obligated to protect. He was among the first senior church leaders in Mexico to speak publicly against drug trafficking after the 1992 constitutional reforms that lifted decades of restrictions on what the Church could say about political and social matters. When those restrictions lifted, Posadas Ocampo was among the voices that immediately filled the space. His successor in Guadalajara, Cardinal Juan Sandoval Iñiguez, would later describe him as a man who raised his head against all of these issues, meaning not just cartels, but the broader nexus of corruption, political complicity, and institutional failure that allowed them to operate. A childhood friend of Posadas Ocampo later provided testimony in connection with the case that added a dimension which prosecutors and investigators took seriously. The friend said the cardinal had told him that he had been summoned to the presidential residence 18 days before his death and had been threatened there, specifically in connection with his complaints about drug cartel activity in Jalisco. This testimony, if accurate, would mean the cardinal died not simply as an accidental victim of a cartel shootout, but as a man who had recently been warned by senior political figures to stop what he was doing and had refused. The friend's account was incorporated into later investigations into the assassination, though its accuracy, like nearly everything connected to this case, has never been formally established to the satisfaction of either the Church or independent investigators. On the afternoon of May 24, 1993, Cardinal Posadas Ocampo traveled to the Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla Guadalajara International Airport. Accounts of his precise reason for being there differ slightly across sources, with some describing him as going to meet the papal nuncio, the Vatican's representative in Mexico, who was arriving by plane, and others saying he was there to receive a fellow priest for a meeting. He arrived in the airport parking lot in a white Mercury Grand Marquis, a luxury vehicle that was, as it happened, exactly the kind of car that major drug traffickers of that era favored and that people associated with cartel wealth routinely drove. That detail would become central to the official explanation for what followed. Also at the airport that afternoon was Joaquin Guzman Loera, El Chapo, who, according to later accounts, was there with associates and was planning to fly to Puerto Vallarta, reportedly for a meeting with senior Mexican government officials. The Arellano Felix organization had sent a hit squad to Guadalajara specifically to kill El Chapo. That squad numbered somewhere between 15 and 20 gunmen, many of them recruited from the Logan Heights street gang in San Diego, California, who had been trained by the Tijuana cartel as assassins. They were there to find El Chapo in the airport and kill him before he could board a plane. What happened next, according to the government's version of events, is that these gunmen saw the white Grand Marquis pulling into the airport parking lot, assumed the man inside was El Chapo, and opened fire. The Cardinal was hit 14 times. His driver was killed. 5 other people died in the parking lot, in the violence that followed. El Chapo, who had been in a different vehicle nearby, fled the airport on foot in the confusion, escaped Guadalajara, and made his way to Guatemala, where he was captured by Guatemalan authorities and extradited to Mexico a few weeks later. The government presented this sequence of events as a tragic case of mistaken identity within hours of the shooting. Cardinal Posadas had been in the wrong place, in the wrong kind of car, at the wrong moment. The gunmen had made an error. That was the official story, stated by the Mexican Attorney General's office while the Cardinal's body was still warm. It was not believed by the Church. The president of the Mexican Episcopal Council demanded authorities stick to the truth, stating that the official version had no credibility. Bishop Juan Sandoval, who would succeed Posadas Ocampo as Archbishop of Guadalajara, said calling it a drug trafficking affair was the easiest way out, and that he neither believed nor accepted that Posadas Ocampo had been mistaken for someone else. The Latin American Bishops' Council president said powerful political and economic interests were related to the cardinal's death. When senior American Catholic officials arrived in Guadalajara for the funeral, Cardinal Roger Mahony of Los Angeles, a close personal friend of the deceased, approached the casket and kissed the cardinal's ring. The room was full of people who publicly doubted what the Mexican government had just told them. What the forensic evidence showed made the official account even harder to accept. The Guadalajara coroner confirmed that the cardinal had been struck by 14 bullets, all fired from fewer than 3 feet away. This was not the pattern of a man caught in crossfire between 2 groups shooting at each other at distance in a parking lot. It was the pattern of a man who had been surrounded and shot at close range by people who had specifically approached his vehicle. Ballistic analysis also showed 52 bullets had struck the cardinal's car in total, a concentration of fire on a single target that was inconsistent with a chaotic, wide-ranging gunfight. A gunpowder residue mark was found on the cardinal's chin, indicating at least 1 shot had been fired from an extremely short distance, possibly point blank. The Archbishop of Washington, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, testified before the U.S. House of Representatives at a 2006 hearing specifically convened to examine the case, stating his strong impression that a travesty of justice had been committed when the initial inquiry concluded that Posadas was simply caught in crossfire. He described the Church's conviction that the killing had been deliberate and that the investigation had been manipulated. Those allegations of manipulation extended into the investigation itself. Later reviews of the case documented that the original investigative files had been reduced from 5 volumes to 3 by 1995, suggesting the destruction or removal of documents. Key leads, including the precise whereabouts of the Arellano Felix brothers during the airport attack, were never pursued. A witness, who was in custody and had knowledge of the shooting, died while in government detention. By 2006, when American authorities arrested Francisco Javier Arellano Felix in the Pacific Ocean aboard a yacht, the U.S. Department of Justice listed the 1993 Guadalajara airport shooting among the charges against him, formally connecting a member of the Tijuana cartel's leadership to the Cardinal's death. But being charged with conspiring to carry out the airport attack was not the same as being convicted of ordering the deliberate assassination of the Cardinal. The legal proceedings that followed never resolved the core question of intent, whether Posadas was killed because he was mistaken for El Chapo or because someone with real power wanted him dead. The Archdiocese's own lawyers, after decades of independent investigation, published their conclusions in a book that described the killing as a premeditated government-connected murder rather than a cartel accident. Attorney Jesus Becerra Pedrote, who led that investigation, stated that the assassination involved people in the inner circle of President Carlos Salinas de Gortari, adding that, while there was no direct evidence Salinas himself ordered it, there was evidence that his people carried it out. He cited nearly 10 witnesses who described rifle-armed men encircling the Cardinal and discharging their weapons directly at him. He stated that officials at top levels of the Mexican army and intelligence services were implicated in what the investigations had found. General Jesus Gutierrez Rebollo, who was later imprisoned in Mexico for drug trafficking, reportedly told investigators that a scenario to kill the Cardinal had been prepared in advance, lending some support to the premeditation theory without conclusively proving it. The case remains officially unsolved more than 30 years later. No one was ever convicted specifically for the murder of Cardinal Posadas Ocampo. The men identified as the operational masterminds of the hit, Juan Francisco Murillo Diaz and Edgar Nicolas Villegas, were named but never fully prosecuted to conviction on charges directly tied to the Cardinal's death. El Chapo himself, writing from prison decades later, in a letter sent to his American trial judge, claimed the Mexican government had used him as a scapegoat and insisted he had simply been at the airport that afternoon, had seen the shooting begin, had dropped his belongings and fled on foot, and had no advance knowledge of what was planned. The letter neither cleared him nor incriminated anyone else in any definitive way. What is not disputed is that Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo spent the final years of his life as the most prominent Catholic voice in Mexico, publicly naming the cartels as a moral catastrophe that the Church had an obligation to resist. He had refused, in more than 40 documented public statements, to be silent about what the trafficking organizations were doing to Mexico and its people. Whether that refusal made him a target, or whether his death was genuinely, catastrophically accidental, is a question Mexico has never formally answered. Both possibilities are terrible in different ways. One means that armed cartel gunmen killed the head of one of Latin America's largest Catholic archdioceses by accident in a busy airport parking lot in the middle of the afternoon without being meaningfully punished for it. The other means that someone decided a cardinal needed to die for what he had been saying, and that the machinery of the Mexican state helped make that happen, and then helped bury the truth afterward. 32 years after the parking lot fell quiet, neither version has been set aside completely, and neither has been proven beyond the disputed terrain of a case that was, by most independent accounts, never honestly investigated to begin with. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From Guadalajara, where a cardinal was shot 14 times in a public parking lot, and the truth of who ordered it has never been established, the story moves to Guerrero State in 2018, where two priest musicians were ambushed on a highway after a religious celebration, and the local government immediately tried to blame them for their own deaths. Section 6. Father Germain Muñiz Garcia and Father Ivan Añorve Jaimes. February 5th is El Día de la Candelaria in Mexico, the Feast of the Presentation, known in the English-speaking world as Candlemas, and it is one of the anchor celebrations of the Catholic calendar year in rural Mexican communities. 40 days after Christmas, families return to church to have the baby Jesus figurines they dressed at Epiphany blessed by the priest. In communities across Guerrero, this celebration often extends beyond a single morning service into an evening of music, food, and communal gathering. For the priests who traveled between the remote villages of the state's interior, February 5th was a working day that ran long into the night. Father Germain Muñiz Garcia and Father Ivan Añorve Jaimes were exactly the kind of priests who would spend that day doing exactly that kind of work, driving from one community to another, celebrating Mass, staying for the music, and then making the long drive back home when everything was finally done. That return drive, in the early hours of February 5th, 2018, was the last trip either of them made. Father Germain Muñiz Garcia was 39 years old at the time of his death, the parish priest of Mezcala, a town in the diocese of Chilpancingo, Chilapa, the same diocese that appears repeatedly across the arc of violence documented in this script. Mezcala sits in the part of Guerrero that had been the state's heroin-producing heartland for decades, a region where the opium poppy economy had shaped everything from land ownership to local government to the informal authority of whoever controlled the surrounding territory. Father Germain was not primarily a political figure or a public anti-cartel activist. He was, first and above all, a musician. Bishop Salvador Rangel Mendoza of Chilpancingo, Chilapa, who knew him well, described him as a priest who used music as his primary form of ministry. He was famed in his diocese for his parish choir, a musical community he had built around himself and through which he approached people in remote hamlets who might not have responded as readily to more conventional forms of evangelization. He was the kind of priest who made the Mass feel like something a community wanted to attend, rather than something it was obligated to perform, and in a part of Mexico where so much of communal life had been hollowed out by violence and displacement, that distinction mattered. Father Ivan Añorve Jaimes was 37 and worked for the Archdiocese of Acapulco, serving as curate of Holy Family Parish in the town of Las Vegas, located in the Costa Chica region of Guerrero's Pacific coast, roughly 5 hours by road from Mezcala. That the two priests were together on the night of February 4th into February 5th says something about how priests in Guerrero functioned in that period. They traveled, they crossed diocesan boundaries, they gathered in communities that needed them on celebration days, combining their resources and their presence, and they drove home afterward through roads that passed through territory controlled by armed groups who answered to no law beyond themselves. Father Añorve had made that kind of drive many times, so had Father Muñiz. Both of them were fully aware of what Guerrero had become. By the time they died, 7 priests had been killed in Guerrero since 2009. Their colleagues in the diocese had received death threats. The Bishop of Altamirano had been transferred out of the region in December 2017 due to a series of threats against him. A bishop in another diocese had been robbed at a roadblock by armed men. Another had been approached for extortion and escaped only because a rival group drove off the men, demanding money before he had to pay. Every priest who drove the roads of Guerrero after dark in 2018 understood, at some level, that the road itself was part of the danger. To understand what they were driving through, it helps to sit with some numbers. In 2017, Guerrero recorded 2,138 homicides, which translated to a murder rate of more than 60 per 100,000 residents. the highest of any Mexican state at the time, and one of the highest homicide rates recorded anywhere in the country since statistics began being reliably tracked. Mexico as a whole had just experienced its most murderous year on record in 2017, surpassing the worst figures from the peak years of Felipe Calderon's military campaign against the cartels. Guerrero was the state that pushed those national numbers hardest. The state's violence had been driven for years by competition between dozens of armed groups fighting over the opium poppy fields in the mountains, the heroin processing operations downstream, and the routes that moved product north. By 2018, that economy was already beginning to be undercut by the rise of fentanyl in the American market, which could be manufactured in labs from chemical precursors rather than grown in fields. But the cartels that had built themselves on poppy had not simply dissolved. They had shifted, in many cases, toward extortion, kidnapping, and the extraction of money from local populations and institutions. Churches and priests were not exempt from that extraction. Priests in Acapulco had publicly described being approached for protection payments. The bishop of their diocese pressed on what the experience of working in Guerrero actually felt like, described the state plainly. All of Guerrero is in the hands of narcotics traffickers. There is an official government and another authority that gives orders. On the night of February 4th, Father Muñiz and Father Añorve, along with 3 companions, had been in the town of Juliantla for the Candlemas celebration. They left sometime after the festivities ended and began driving north on the federal highway connecting Taxco and Iguala, the same stretch of road that connected 2 cities that had become grimly well known in Mexican crime reporting. Iguala was where the 43 Ayotzinapa students had been handed to the Guerreros Unidos cartel in 2014. Taxco was a silver mining city whose colonial charm drew tourists to streets that, after dark, were controlled by armed groups that had nothing to do with tourism. The highway between them passed through territory claimed by multiple competing criminal organizations, and driving it in the small hours of the morning was something every local understood to carry real risk. An armed group cut them off. A vehicle blocked the highway, and gunmen opened fire on the priest's car without warning. Father Muñiz Garcia and Father Añorve Jaimes, both seated at the front of the vehicle, were killed instantly. The 3 other passengers, riding in the back, were injured. Police who arrived at the scene afterward found an abandoned vehicle approximately 1 kilometer away that contained a military-style bandolier and a rifle holder. The gunmen had not lingered to make sure of anything. They had blocked the road, opened fire, and gone. What happened in the days immediately following the killing added a dimension to this case that sets it apart from most of the others in this script, because the most damaging attack on the 2 dead priests came not from the armed group that had murdered them, but from their own state government. On February 6th, 1 day after the shooting, Guerrero State Prosecutor Xavier Olea called a press conference. At that press conference, he presented a photograph. The photo showed Father Germain Muñiz Garcia holding an assault rifle and posing alongside masked individuals during what appeared to be a Candlemas celebration. Olea's interpretation of this photograph was that Father Muñiz had links to illegal armed groups and that gunmen had attacked the priest's vehicle because the cartel faction that ambushed them suspected it was carrying members of a rival organization. The implication was unmistakable. The priest who had just been killed had been mixed up with criminals, and the attack had been, if not exactly justified, then at least explicable in terms of cartel logic rather than random violence against the clergy. Olea also said the priests had been drinking at a celebration attended by narcotics traffickers from 3 states, a detail that appeared designed to suggest the victims had placed themselves in dangerous company willingly. Bishop Rangel's response was immediate, forceful, and entirely public. He did not simply dispute the prosecutor's account. He called it fictional. He confirmed, speaking directly to journalist Carlos Loret de Mola in an interview that received wide coverage, that the photograph of Father Muñiz was authentic and that it was at least a year old. He did not deny that the photo existed or that Father Muñiz had held a rifle in it at some point during a previous Candlemas celebration. What he rejected, absolutely, was the prosecutor's interpretation of what that photograph meant about who the priest was, what his connections were, and why he had been killed. Bishop Rangel said that because of the nature of his pastoral work, Father Muñiz was necessarily aware of organized crime operations in the area, since a priest traveling between remote communities in Guerrero could not do his job without crossing through territory those organizations controlled. Knowledge of criminal operations was not the same as membership in them. The bishop demanded the prosecutor name specifically which criminal group Father Muñiz allegedly belonged to before making public accusations that were damaging the reputation of a dead man, and he called for the inflammatory statements to be retracted unless hard evidence could be produced to support them. Christian Solidarity Worldwide, the advocacy organization that monitors persecution of religious communities internationally, issued a statement condemning the prosecutor's conduct as essentially amounting to blaming the victims for their own murder. They noted that the two priests were fully aware of the risks of pastoral work in Guerrero and had continued their ministry precisely because the communities that needed them had no one else to turn to. The Mexican Bishops' Conference also formally condemned the prosecutor's statements, confirming that neither priest had any links to illegal criminal groups. The statement from the Archdiocese of Acapulco, which Father Añorve had served, was quieter in its language but equally clear. The Church mourned the men, it called for truth and justice, and it specifically asked that its priests not be posthumously smeared by officials whose institutional interest in deflecting responsibility was obvious to everyone paying attention. The photograph had been leaked to the Mexican press, presumably by state officials, along with another image that showed Bishop Rangel himself with 3 unidentified men in front of a helicopter, a pairing that seemed designed to spread the insinuation broadly. Not just the dead priest, but his bishop too, might have unsavory associations. Rangel addressed this directly as well, noting that his approach to ministry in Guerrero required him to travel by helicopter to reach remote communities, and that the men in the photo were simply people he had encountered in the course of that work. He was not especially surprised by the tactic. He had already said publicly that some politicians have narcotics traffickers as their godfathers, and they don't like this because they also act this way, with impunity and with protection from the police. The state government's response to the deaths of 2 priests had confirmed, rather than contradicted, the picture he had been describing of Guerrero for years. Nobody was ever arrested for the murders of Father Germain Muñiz Garcia and Father Ivan Añorve Jaimes. The Guerrero state government opened an investigation and produced no charges, no suspects, no prosecution. The men who blocked the highway and opened fire on a vehicle carrying 2 priests and 3 companions coming home from a Candlemas celebration were never identified publicly, never named, never brought before a court. The case joined the same pattern that Bishop Maximino Martinez had described after Father López Gorostieta's death in 2014, and that the Catholic Multimedia Center had been tracking since 2006. The overwhelming majority of murders of priests in Mexico were never punished. By early 2018, 21 priests had been killed since December of 2012. The overwhelming majority of those cases remained unresolved. This one became part of that majority without ceremony. Its investigation closed before it had properly begun, the state's primary public contribution to accountability having been a press conference that tried to make the victims responsible for their own deaths. What the bishop said about this state of affairs in the months and years following the ambush, described something that had long since stopped being a crisis and had become a permanent condition. He had said, "All of Guerrero is in the hands of narcotics traffickers." He said there is an official government and another authority that gives orders. He said some politicians are not in agreement with him because they have narcotics traffickers as their godfathers. These were not dramatic accusations made in the heat of grief. They were the considered assessments of a bishop who had spent years trying to navigate a state where the space between the church and organized crime had been forced closer and closer together by the failure of everything else, and where the price of remaining in that space was sometimes paid by priests like Father Germain and Father Ivan, who drove home after a celebration and never arrived. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From Guerrero, where two priest musicians were ambushed on a highway and the state government immediately moved to discredit them, the story shifts to Veracruz, where two other priests were dragged at gunpoint from their parish after evening mass and found the following day bound and shot on a highway outside the city. Section 7. Father Alejo Nabor Jimenez Juarez and Father José Alfredo Juárez de la Cruz. The Diocese of Papantla covered the coastal and inland communities of northern Veracruz, including Poza Rica and the surrounding oil country municipalities, and its priests operated in neighborhoods where the Catholic parish was often the most consistent institution left functioning when everything else had been hollowed out by violence and corruption. Our Lady of Fatima Parish was located on the outskirts of Poza Rica, in a low-income neighborhood, the kind of community where the families who couldn't afford to live anywhere safer had settled, and where the local church was frequently the most reliable gathering point in daily life. Father Alejo Nabor Jimenez Juarez was 50 years old and had served Our Lady of Fatima's parishioners for more than 6 years by the time he was killed. He was described by his diocese and by the vicar who knew him well as beloved by the faithful, a phrase that in Catholic reporting can sometimes feel like standard language, but that in this case was backed by a 6-year record of consistent, daily service in one of Poza Rica's most difficult neighborhoods. A business owner who operated across the street from the church and who spoke to Associated Press reporters in the days after the killing described the priests as respected community leaders, the kind of people who, in that part of the city, were visible and known to everyone for the right reasons rather than the wrong ones. Father Alejo had built himself into the fabric of that parish over years, the way priests who stay in one place long enough sometimes do, becoming part of the neighborhood's understanding of itself. Father José Alfredo Juárez de la Cruz was younger, also assigned to the Papantla diocese, serving in the same parish alongside Father Alejo. He had been working in that capacity at the time of his death. Between them, they had built the kind of parish presence that required showing up consistently, year after year, in a neighborhood where showing up required navigating everything that Poza Rica's violence and insecurity had become by the middle of the second decade of the 21st century. On the evening of Sunday, September 18th, 2016, both priests were at Our Lady of Fatima Parish for the 6:30 Mass, the last service of the day. Father Alejo had spent the day visiting other churches in the area before returning for the evening service, the kind of Sunday workday that parish priests in Mexican dioceses often had, moving between communities rather than staying in one place. After Mass ended, the church emptied out and the evening settled into quiet. By that point, only Father Alejo, Father Alfredo, and their driver remained at the parish. What happened next was witnessed by the driver, who was also taken in the attack and who survived, but who was placed under police protection afterward and did not speak publicly about what he had seen. Armed men entered the parish. They took all 3 men by force. The driver managed to escape at some point during what followed, found himself free, and was placed under official protection by Veracruz state authorities, who interviewed him as a witness. He was not identified publicly in any of the reporting that followed. Father Alejo and Father Alfredo were not so fortunate. Their bodies were found the following morning, September 19th, 2016, along the roadside on the highway connecting Papantla to Poza Rica, in an area whose informal local name was the Devil's Curve, a stretch of road that had accumulated enough bodies over the years that the nickname carried its own grim weight. Both priests had their hands and feet bound. Both had been beaten. Both had gunshot wounds. Father Alfredo Juarez de la Cruz was lying face down in the blood-soaked grass, still wearing his green liturgical stole, the vestment worn during ordinary time in the Catholic calendar, embroidered with large gold crosses. His killers had used that stole to bind his hands behind his back. A white cloth lay beside him. Father Alejo's body was nearby, shot 9 times. The Diocese of Papantla released a statement the same day, identifying the 2 priests and expressing the bishop's conference's pain and outrage. The statement called on authorities to clarify what had happened and to enforce justice against those responsible. Pope Francis addressed the deaths at his Sunday Angelus address, expressing his closeness to Mexico's bishops and his support for the church and civil society in a country requiring special pastoral attention. The Mexican Bishops' Conference called the killings a moment of pain, impotence, and tragedy provoked by violence, and asked for the eternal rest of the 2 brothers and the conversion of their aggressors. All of this reflected the standard church response to a murder it could neither prevent nor explain with any certainty. The explanation that arrived from the state came 1 day after the bodies were discovered, and it was immediately deeply controversial. Veracruz State Prosecutor Luis Angel Bravo Contreras told reporters on September 20th that the victims and their victimizers knew each other, that the attack was not a kidnapping, and that the gathering had broken down due to alcohol and turned violent. The prosecutor's account described the priests as having been drinking socially with the men who killed them, suggesting the entire situation had arisen from a drunken dispute rather than a premeditated abduction. As a secondary detail, Bravo cited the robbery of a church building fund, with the money taken estimated at around 5,000 pesos, roughly $250 at 2016 exchange rates, as the apparent motive. This amount was so small relative to the violence committed that the suggestion felt almost insulting to people who were already grieving. Bravo also said 5 men had participated in the abductions and that one suspect's identity was known, but no arrest followed that statement in any time frame that received public documentation. The church's rejection of this version was swift and thorough. The spokesman for the Archdiocese of Jalapa, Father José Manuel Suazo Reyes, described the prosecutor's explanation as an easy out, adding that it ignored the reality of a state notorious for crime and corruption. He told reporters that the declaration generated more doubts than responses and expressed surprise at how quickly authorities claimed to have reached conclusions in an investigation that required far more time and care than they had apparently devoted to it. Catholic officials in Veracruz rejected the prosecutor's account as a whole, calling it exactly what it was, a characterization of dead men that had the effect of making them responsible for their own murders without any supporting evidence that could withstand scrutiny. This pattern, as Bishop Rangel had noted after the Guerrero killings of Fathers Muñiz and Añorve just a few months earlier, was a documented tendency of Mexican state prosecutors. When an investigation into the killing of a priest was difficult or politically inconvenient, blame the victim. The technique had been deployed in Guerrero with a photograph and in Veracruz with an allegation of drinking. The result in both cases was the same. The dead men's reputations were damaged. The investigation was effectively closed before it began, and no one was held accountable. A spokesperson for the Christian Solidarity Worldwide Advocacy Organization noted that Poza Rica and surrounding areas had been the locus of drug and cartel violence for years, and that the Zetas and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel were actively battling for control of the region at the time of the priests' deaths. The state prosecutor had explicitly dismissed suggestions that a drug cartel might be involved, which struck many observers as a position requiring considerable confidence given the documented presence of multiple armed criminal organizations in the area and the pattern of violence against clerics that Veracruz had been accumulating for years. In 2013, 2 priests in the Diocese of Tuxpan had been murdered in their parish. The deaths of Fathers Alejo and Alfredo brought the total number of priests murdered in Mexico since 2012 to 14 by the church's own count. Veracruz was not an outlier in that count. It was one of the states driving it. People in the neighborhood surrounding Our Lady of Fatima Parish spoke to reporters in the days after the killings, consistently and unanimously from behind a shield of anonymity. One business owner with a view of the church building, describing the way Poza Rica residents had learned to process violent death, said that, usually, when the newspaper reported 2 or 3 dead per day, the general response was to assume the victims had done something to bring it on themselves. The casual brutality of that calculus, this man implied, was simply the product of years of living in a city where cartel logic had colonized daily thinking. But the priests were different, he said, because they were known, because they were respected, and because for many people in that neighborhood, they had been the most consistent source of stability in a community that had precious little stability left. Nobody was ever charged or convicted for the murders of Father Alejo Nabor Jimenez Juarez and Father Jose Alfredo Juarez de la Cruz. The 5 men the prosecutor said had participated in the abduction were never named publicly, never arrested, never prosecuted. The one suspect whose identity the state claimed to know in September of 2016 apparently remained free, unidentified to the public, unaccounted for in any court proceeding that was ever reported. The case joined the expanding roster of priest murders in Mexico that the Catholic Multimedia Center tracked year after year, noting consistently that the overwhelming majority of such cases were overwhelmingly never punished. By 2018, the Multimedia Center had counted 21 priests killed since 2012. By 2024, the count since 2006 had grown past 50. The murders of Father Alejo and Father Alfredo were 2 data points within that count, processed through a state criminal justice system that had been so thoroughly compromised by cartel influence and executive corruption during the Duarte years that the priest in charge of communications for the Archdiocese of Jalapa felt comfortable saying openly to journalists that the investigation generated more doubts than it resolved, and that the conclusions reached couldn't withstand honest scrutiny. What the 2 priests had been doing on the night they were killed was nothing complicated or politically charged. They had celebrated Mass for the last time at a church they knew and served, and had spent years building into a community anchor in one of the most difficult neighborhoods in a city that had been failing its residents for a generation. Father Alejo had been visiting other churches during the day, moving through the ordinary rounds of a diocesan priest on a Sunday in northern Veracruz. They were still at the parish that evening, only because the work of the day wasn't finished until the last Mass was done. The men who took them from that parish took them because of something, for money, for some cartel logic that may never be fully explained. For a reason, the state prosecutor chose to dress up as an accidental social gathering turned violent. The liturgical stole used to bind Father Alfredo's hands had gold crosses on it. Whatever the reason, it had nothing to do with the crosses. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From Veracruz, where 2 priests were taken from their parish after the final Mass of a Sunday evening and found bound on a roadside the following morning, the story crosses south into Colombia, where an evangelical pastor was gunned down with his wife and daughter at a restaurant table after Sunday service. in a city where organized crime had spent years trying to extract money from churches and silence the pastors who refused to pay. Section 8. Pastor Marlon Laura. By 2024, the city of Aguachica was still navigating the consequences of decades of armed conflict, with criminal organizations operating in the gaps that demobilization processes and peace agreements had never fully closed. It is the kind of city where a pastor who leads 35 churches across multiple municipalities knows, at some level, that the work he does places him in close and regular contact with the communities that cartel organizations also claim authority over. Evangelical and Protestant pastors across Caesar and neighboring departments had been facing escalating pressure from armed groups for years, with extortion demands directed at churches, threats against leaders who preached against criminal activity, and, in some documented cases, killings. Pastor Marlon Laura had been aware of this pressure. His supervisor, Pastor Giovanni Bermudez, told advocacy organizations in the weeks after the killing that Marlon was like many pastors, keeping quiet about many things so that everything ran smoothly, even while carrying heavy burdens inside. His wife Yurley Rincon had reportedly received threatening phone calls from private numbers in the period before his death. He had not shared the details of those threats with those around him in the way that pastors in dangerous regions of Colombia often do, absorbing the weight of what they know rather than alarming the people they are responsible for leading. Marlon Yamith Laura was 43 years old on the day he was killed. He led the Prince of Peace Villa Paraguay Church in Aguachica, a congregation that was part of the Missionaries Biblical Church's denomination, and through his work he oversaw and regularly traveled to 35 urban and rural churches spread across Aguachica, Pelaya, San Alberto, San Martin, and other communities in the Santander region, making him one of the more significant evangelical leaders in the area by any organizational measure. His wife, Yurley Rincon, 40 years old, led the church alongside him. Their daughter, Angela Natalia, 24, was a communications and journalism professional who worked for Aguachica's public utilities company. Their son, Santiago, 21, was a systems engineering student. The family was, by every account from people who knew them, exactly what they appeared to be: a deeply committed pastoral family, living close to their congregation, carrying out quiet, consistent ministry work in a city that needed it, and doing so without any connection to the criminal world that their community was surrounded by. That last point is important because the investigation that followed the killing confirmed it explicitly. On Sunday, December 29th, 2024, the Laura family attended their own church service as they did every week. After the service ended, they walked to a nearby restaurant to have lunch together, a family tradition, a routine Sunday the family followed consistently because the restaurant was only 2 blocks from their church, and because Sunday lunch together, after services, was simply part of how they lived. The restaurant was called Sorbetes y Jugos. They arrived and sat down, a family of 4, in the center of Aguachica, just meters away from the National Police Station. The proximity to the police station had always felt like a marginal layer of safety in a city where safety was never guaranteed. On that Sunday, it offered none. What the Laura family did not know, and could not have known, was that a different woman was also eating at a table nearby in that restaurant that Sunday. Her name was Zaida Andrea Sanchez Polanco, known in criminal circles by the nickname La Diabla. She was the partner of a drug trafficker named Alexander Gonzalez Perez, known as El Calvo, a feared cartel figure from the Caribbean coastal region. El Calvo had been killed 2 days earlier, on December 27th, in the municipality of El Banco in Magdalena Department, murdered in what investigators later determined was retaliation ordered by a drug trafficker based in Barranquilla over a lost cocaine shipment. La Diabla had come to Aguachica for El Calvo's wake and burial. She was in the city in grief and in danger, the kind of danger that follows people who are close to major cartel figures when those figures are killed and their enemies turn to everyone around them. The hit squad had been organized from inside a Colombian prison. The person identified as coordinating the attack, a man investigators identified by the alias El Logistico, planned and communicated the operation while detained, a detail that speaks to how little prison walls in Colombia constrain the operational capacity of organized crime. 4 men traveled to Aguachica from Barranquilla and Norte de Santander for the job. Jairo Andrés Miranda Ramirez, who went by the nickname El Logistico, at the operational level, coordinated logistics. Leonardo de Jesus Barraza Castillo was assigned to surveil La Diabla's movements and mark her location. Jorge Luis Valderrama Cuba drove one of the motorcycles. José Miguel Leal Rodriguez was the shooter. The 4 men arrived in the city on December 29th, between 10 and 11 in the morning, collected 2 motorcycles from a hotel parking lot they had reserved for the vehicles, and proceeded to the restaurant where their target had been located. The confusion was a matter of clothing. Ángela Natalia Lora, the pastor's daughter, was wearing an outfit that the shooter interpreted, at distance and in the rapid, committed way that hitmen make assessments before acting, as the same outfit worn by Zaida Andrea Sanchez. Both women had similar physical characteristics. The shooter made his decision. He opened fire on the Lora family table. He shot Pastor Marlon Lora first, then Ángela Natalia, then Santiago, then Yorle Rincon. Pastor Marlon Lora, Yorle Rincon, and Ángela Natalia were killed at the table. Santiago, grievously wounded, was transported to a hospital in Cesar and died there on December 31st, 2 days after the attack. All 4 members of the Lora family were dead within 48 hours. Zaida Andrea Sanchez, sitting close enough to hear everything, fled the restaurant during the shooting. The shooter, realizing he had hit the wrong people, looked for her as she ran, but was intercepted by an armed escort who returned fire. The sicarios escaped Aguachica in the confusion. La Diabla herself was killed on January 22, 2025, less than a month later, shot in the Naranjal neighborhood of Medellin, likely by the same criminal network that had commissioned the original hit in Aguachica. Her death closed that particular chain of violence without resolving it. The people who ordered El Calvo's killing, and who then ordered La Diabla's killing, and who caused the Lora family to die in between because of a moment of mistaken identity in a restaurant, were operating inside a criminal ecosystem so pervasive and so normalized in that part of Colombia that the death of a pastor and his entire family at a Sunday lunch table barely interrupted its logic at all. The investigation moved faster than most in Colombia. The National Police and the Attorney General's Technical Investigation Unit analyzed over 2 million call records and reviewed 900 hours of security camera footage. One breakthrough came from a simple error. The driver of the getaway motorcycle had scouted the restaurant area the day before the attack with his face uncovered, visible on security cameras in a way that allowed investigators to identify him. The arrests happened on February 27, 2025, in Cúcuta, exactly 60 days after the killing. The National Director of the Colombian Police, General Carlos Fernando Triana, announced the captures publicly, describing 60 days of meticulous investigative work. The 4 men arrested were Jairo Andrés Miranda Ramirez, José Miguel Leal Rodriguez, Jorge Luis Valderrama Cuba, and Leonardo de Jesus Barraza Castillo. A judge with control of guarantees functions ordered all 4 sent to prison pending trial. The investigation identified them by role: the attack coordinator, the logistical coordinator, the shooter, and the motorcycle driver. The person who ordered the attack from prison was separately identified as under investigation. By early March 2025, the Attorney General's office had confirmed publicly that the family of Pastor Marlon Lora had no connection to narco-trafficking, and that the killing had been an error of identification in a planned cartel hit. The community response to what happened in Aguachica was immediate and profound. Mayor Gracie Roquem declared a curfew the evening of the attack and called on the national government to address the escalating violence in the region. She described the Lora family as a pillar of the community. The national government and the governorate of Cesar announced a reward of 50 million pesos for information on those responsible, a figure that in Colombian terms represented real urgency. The Colombian Council of Evangelical Churches condemned the attack in a formal statement, as did multiple other religious and civil society organizations across the country. Colombian President Gustavo Petro described the killing as a serious affront to the right to life, religious freedom, and the spiritual and community work that so many people carry out in regions historically marked by violence. Vigils were held across Aguachica in the days following the attack. The church Pastor Lora had led was reopened in the weeks that followed, with the congregation declaring it would continue the legacy he had built. What makes the case sit so uncomfortably alongside the others in this list is the specific cruelty of the finding. It would be one thing, in the logic of the violence that surrounds evangelical pastors in Colombia, to say that Pastor Marlon Lora was killed because he refused cartel demands, because he preached against criminal activity, because his ministry stood as an obstacle to the organizations that wanted his community's silence and compliance. There is documented evidence that pastors in Colombia face exactly that kind of threat, and that the pressure to refuse it comes with real danger. Lora himself appears to have carried threats in silence. His wife received calls from private numbers. The broader pattern of violence against Colombian religious leaders is documented and consistent, but the investigation into this specific killing found that the pastor and his family were not killed for any of that. They were killed because a hitman sent to murder a cartel member's girlfriend looked at a 24-year-old woman across a restaurant and saw the wrong person in similar clothing. The violence of organized crime in Colombia does not require a reason to reach a pastor's family at a Sunday lunch table. It only requires proximity, coincidence, and the presence of someone else in that ecosystem who has made the kinds of enemies who resolve disputes by sending men with guns to restaurants in broad daylight. The Lora family had nothing to do with any of that. They went to church, they had lunch together as they did every Sunday, and they died because the world they ministered into was saturated with a violence that does not stop at the doors of a church, or ask questions before it fires, or care at all about the difference between a cartel associate's girlfriend and a pastor's daughter who happened to be wearing similar clothes that morning. The four people who were supposed to protect the city's residents were eating their own lunch at the police station 2 blocks away when it happened. The curfew came after. The arrests came 60 days after. The explanation came 3 months after. The Lora family did not come back. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From Aguachica, where a pastor's family died in a case of mistaken identity that revealed just how completely cartel violence has saturated the communities where Colombia's evangelical churches operate, the story returns to Guerrero State in Mexico, where a priest was found shot in the neck 56 miles from the route he should have been driving, in a region so thoroughly controlled by criminal groups that even his own driver became a suspect. Section 9. Father Bertoldo Pantaleon Estrada Mezcala is a small municipality in the state of Guerrero, about 150 miles south of Mexico City, close enough to the capital that a determined driver could make the trip in under 3 hours on good roads. But the geography of Guerrero has never been about distance in the ordinary sense. The mountains, the poorly maintained roads, and the decades of institutional neglect have made even short journeys carry a kind of weight that people living in safer places don't carry with them on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. Mezcala sits in a region that was, for a generation, the heroin-producing heartland of Mexico, its hillsides cultivating the opium poppies that fed trafficking routes running north toward the United States border. When fentanyl arrived in the American market and crashed the price of opium paste by roughly 80% in a few short years, that heroin economy largely collapsed. The criminal groups that had built themselves on it did not collapse. They pivoted. They moved into extortion, kidnapping, control of local governments, and the extraction of revenue from every institution within their territory, including churches. In 2025, the year Father Bertoldo Pantaleon Estrada was killed, the two dominant armed groups fighting for control of the Mezcala region were Los Ardillos and Los Tacos, both of them territorial, both of them violent, and both of them operating in a state where the distance between church and cartel had been narrowing for decades. The Diocese of Chilpancingo Chilapa, which Father Pantaleon served, has one of the bloodiest records of any diocese in Mexico when it comes to violence against clergy. The Ugandan missionary Father John Senyondo was abducted and found in a mass grave within this same diocese in 2014. The two priests, Father Germain Muñiz Garcia and Father Ivan Añorve Jaimes, were ambushed on a highway within this same diocese in 2018. Bishop Salvador Rangel, who led the diocese from 2015 to 2022 and became famous in Mexico for his strategy of personal dialogue with cartel leaders, was kidnapped in 2024 and found alive, hospitalized, in the same general region. The diocese had been a front line of cartel violence against religious figures for 15 years by the time Father Pantaleon disappeared on October 5, 2025, and the people serving in its parishes understood, as a baseline condition of their work, that the territory they ministered to was also, simultaneously, contested cartel territory. Father Bertoldo Pantaleon Estrada was 59 years old at the time of his death, the parish priest of San Cristobal Parish in the town of Mezcala. He had served the community in that role for some years, building the kind of relationship with a congregation that comes from showing up consistently in a place where consistent presence is itself a form of courage. The region around Mezcala is described by everyone who covers Guerrero's violence as saturated with organized crime activity. Los Ardillos and Los Tacos had been engaged in a violent territorial conflict in the area for an extended period, and the pattern of that conflict was not confined to confrontations between armed men on empty roads. It spread into communities, into local governments, into elections, and into every institution that had any claim on loyalty or resources within the contested zone. Between 2019 and 2024, the Catholic Multimedia Center had documented not just 10 priest killings across Mexico, but 900 separate cases of extortion, death threats, or violence against Catholic clergy. Mezcala's diocese was disproportionately represented in those numbers. On October 5, 2025, Father Pantaleon left the town of Atzcala, in the neighboring municipality of Cocula, to return to his parish in Mezcala. The drive between the two towns should have taken approximately 30 minutes. It was a short, routine journey of the kind that a priest who serves rural parishes in Guerrero makes regularly and without much thought, because the alternative is to stop serving. He did not arrive. His diocese reported him missing. The days that followed were the worst kind of waiting, the kind that people in Guerrero have grown too familiar with, where a priest, or a mayor, or an ordinary person simply disappears from a road that exists on a map but functions, in practice, inside a different order of authority than the map suggests. On October 6th, 2 days after he disappeared, the body of Father Bertoldo Pantaleon Estrada was found on a highway in the municipality of Eduardo Neri, which lies roughly 90 kilometers south of Atzcala and roughly 65 kilometers south of Mezcala. He had not been traveling south. There was no reason he should have been anywhere near Eduardo Neri on a 30-minute drive from Atzcala to Mezcala. The geographic displacement of the body was one of the first details that made the case deeply confusing and, for the people who loved him, deeply troubling. He was found inside his vehicle. Mexican television network Milenio reported that he had been shot twice in the neck. Christian Solidarity Worldwide, which monitors violence against religious communities internationally, and which issued one of the more detailed public accounts of the case, described his body as having sustained multiple gunshot wounds inside his vehicle on the highway, in an area that was controlled by rival criminal organizations. The government's initial account of what had happened generated immediate controversy. Federal Public Security Secretary Omar Garcia Harfuch told reporters on October 7th that everything indicated the priest died in his truck, that he was killed in his truck while about to head out to say Mass, and that everything indicated it was his own driver who was responsible. He added that at that time, there was no indication the father was involved in anything wrong, a statement that both attempted to exonerate the priest from any suspicion of criminal involvement and simultaneously point investigation towards someone who had been in his company. Garcia Harfuch's suggestion that the priest had a driver was immediately rejected by the Diocese of Chilpancingo-Chilapa, which stated clearly and publicly that Father Pantaleon Estrada did not have a chauffeur. The diocese said this was not a minor detail. The official narrative of the killing had been built, from the first day, around someone who did not exist in Father Pantaleon's actual life. Police arrested a suspect on October 10th, 4 days after the body was discovered. The man was identified publicly only as Miguel Ángel N., following the standard Mexican practice of withholding surnames during early investigative stages, and described as an acquaintance of the priest who had given inconsistent accounts of his last meeting with Father Pantaleon. The arrest was announced with the kind of official language that sounds like progress but contains very little information. How, why, and who gave the order, if there was an order, remained unstated. What Miguel Ángel N. had specifically said in his inconsistent accounts was not made public. Whether he was connected to Los Ardillos, Los Tacos, or any other criminal organization operating in the area was not disclosed in any reporting that followed. The reaction from the Catholic community in Guerrero was immediate, organized, and explicitly skeptical. On October 11th, at least 400 Catholic clergy and churchgoers marched through Chilpancingo in what organizers called a caravan of peace and justice, demanding accountability in the investigation into Father Pantaleon's death. The march was not simply an expression of grief, though it was that too. It was a statement that the community had no confidence in the investigation and intended to say so publicly and persistently. This was not an unusual posture for Catholic groups in Guerrero. The Catholic Multimedia Center had been tracking priest killings in Mexico for years and had documented what its spokesperson, Guillermo Ganzanini, described plainly in a public discussion after Father Pantaleon's death. Unfortunately, a case appears in a newspaper with 8 columns of coverage, but the follow-through fades. The families never find out what happened. There is no official answer from the institutions about the results of investigations. He was describing a system that routinely generates initial attention and then produces nothing that could be described, in any honest sense, as justice. The context in which this priest died had been building for more than a year before his disappearance. In October of 2024, Chilpancingo Mayor Alejandro Arcos Catalan had been decapitated less than a week after taking office. The Ardillos and the Tlacos, the two main armed groups fighting for control of the state capital, had made what was already one of Mexico's most dangerous states feel like it had crossed into a different and more openly violent phase of its cartel wars. Security experts studying Guerrero in that period described a shift in what the criminal groups were fighting over. With heroin gone as a revenue source, the primary contests were for control of local governments, public works contracts, traffic fine collection, and extortion from every business and institution operating in their territory. Churches were businesses in this framework. Their collections were money. Their priests were figures of authority who either cooperated with that framework or became problems within it. Father Pantaleon had been serving Mezcala at the intersection of that framework. In a parish sitting inside territory where two rival armed groups, Los Ardillos and Los Tacos, were engaged in ongoing violent conflict. The Catholic Multimedia Center noted that between 2019 and 2024 alone, 900 cases of extortion, death threats, or violence against Catholic clergy had been documented across Mexico, a figure that averages to roughly one incident every 2 days across the country over a 5-year period. In the Diocese of Chilpancingo, Chilapa, given what had already happened to Señondo, to Fathers Muñiz and Añorve, and to Bishop Rangel himself, that national average was almost certainly an undercount of what priests in this particular diocese experienced. The unanswered question at the center of Father Pantaleon's case is why his truck was found 65 kilometers south of the route he should have been traveling. The Christian Solidarity Worldwide statement on the case noted explicitly that no explanation had been provided for why the priest had apparently traveled so far south of his parish. The displacement of the body from its logical geographic location suggests strongly that someone moved him or took him somewhere before he was killed, or that he was redirected from his intended route by force at some point during that 30-minute drive. None of these possibilities points toward an accidental death or toward a spontaneous dispute between the priest and a person he knew casually. All of them point toward something organized enough to have a destination in mind. The Mexican Bishops' Conference released a statement on October 6th, the day the body was discovered, demanding a prompt, thorough, and transparent investigation, and stating that no form of violence can have a place in a society that honors life. The Bishop of Chilpancingo, Chilapa, Father José de Jesús González Hernández, released a statement saying that as bishop, and on behalf of the entire diocesan community, he forgave those directly involved for these acts, while leaving the administration of justice to the appropriate authorities. Both statements followed the form of what the Catholic Church in Mexico had learned over decades of priest killings in this diocese and across the country to say in the immediate aftermath of a murder, language that is spiritually coherent, that does not inflame, and that asks for justice from institutions that have a documented record of failing to provide it. The bishop's statement of forgiveness was addressed to people who had not been identified, had not been convicted, and had not explained themselves. What the case of Father Bertoldo Pantaleon Estrada adds to the record documented in this script is this: 62 priests had been killed in Mexico between 2006 and the time of his death. According to the Catholic Multimedia Center, with his killing having occurred in the same diocese that had now seen multiple such deaths, in a state where cartel violence had become so normalized that the mayor of the state capital could be decapitated inside a week of taking office without prompting any change in the government's approach to organized crime. The priest's body was found on a highway in the wrong municipality, shot in a vehicle he should not have been in where he was found, in a region controlled by armed groups that taxed, threatened, and in documented cases killed the institutions operating within their territory. The diocese did not have a chauffeur. The initial government account was contradicted by the people who knew the dead man best. The investigation produced one arrest and no conviction in any time frame the public record reflects. The 400 people who marched through Chilpancingo in October of 2025 were not marching because they trusted the system. They were marching because they had learned, through 15 years of exactly this kind of death and exactly this kind of response, that marching was the only form of accountability left to them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. From Guerrero, where a priest was found shot on a highway 65 kilometers from where he should have been, in a region where the criminal groups competing for territory treat churches as revenue sources and priests as people who comply or become problems, the story comes to its final case, back in Guerrero again, to a seminary priest named Father Jose Acuña Ascensión Osorio, whose body was pulled from a river in 2014 in the third killing of a cleric in the Diocese of Altamirano that year, in territory controlled by the same cartel being blamed for the disappearance of 43 students just months before his death. Section 10. Father Jose Acuña Ascensión Osorio, San Miguel Totolapan, is one of those names in Guerrero that keeps appearing in reports about organized crime, disappearances, and violence, the way a deep bruise keeps reappearing, no matter how long it has supposedly been healing. The municipality sits in the Tierra Caliente region, directly adjacent to Ajuchitlan del Progreso, and together, the two areas make up what security analysts who study Guerrero consistently identify as among the highest violence zones in a state that already competes for the highest homicide rates in Mexico. By 2014, the year Father Jose Acuña Ascensión Osorio was killed, San Miguel Totolapan had already seen waves of forced displacement, mass kidnappings of civilians, and the kind of turf warfare between competing criminal organizations that turns ordinary communities into places where the safest thing to do is leave. Hundreds of families had fled the area in 2013 alone. By the following summer, entire villages in the surrounding municipality had emptied, their residents choosing to walk through mountains for hours rather than remain in communities where La Familia Michoacana, Guerreros Unidos, and other armed groups were openly fighting each other for control of the poppy fields and transit routes that constituted the regional economy. Into this environment, and in many ways against all reasonable instinct of self-preservation, Father Jose Acuña Ascensión Osorio went and stayed. He was the parish priest of San Miguel Totolapan, a community dominated at that time by the Guerreros Unidos cartel. The Diocese of Altamirano, which included his parish, and which was headquartered in Ciudad Altamirano, roughly 40 miles to the northwest, had been accumulating a grim record of violence against its priests for years. The same diocese had seen Father John Señondo disappear in April of 2014, his body found months later in a mass grave. The same diocese would later see Father Gregorio López Gorostieta kidnapped from his seminary and found dead on Christmas Day at the end of that same year. In a small diocese of 37 parishes, 3 clergy killed in a single year was not a statistical anomaly. It was a pattern, and it was a pattern that the people running the diocese, the priests serving within it, and the communities depending on them, all understood as clearly as any pattern can be understood when the consequence of naming it is also dangerous. The Guerreros Unidos cartel that controlled the area around San Miguel Totolapan had built itself from the remains of the Beltran Leyva organization after that organization fractured following the death of its leader, Arturo Beltran Leyva, in 2009. By 2014, the group operated across 30 or more municipalities in Guerrero, with its sphere of influence centered on the regions of Centro, Norte, and Tierra Caliente. Its primary income sources were opium paste and heroin sales from the poppy fields that covered significant portions of Guerrero's mountain terrain, along with kidnapping and extortion, which had become increasingly important revenue streams as the group fragmented and as law enforcement pressure disrupted parts of the drug trade. The Guerreros Unidos' approach to extortion was systematic and comprehensive. They taxed farmers, taxed businesses, taxed local government, and in many documented cases, taxed churches, demanding that religious institutions contribute to the cartel's operating budget the same way every other revenue source in their territory was expected to contribute. Bishop Maximino Martinez Miranda, who oversaw the Diocese of Altamirano and who would speak extensively to reporters after Father Lopez Gorostieta's death at the end of 2014, described the environment his priests worked in with a precision that came from daily, lived experience rather than from a distance. He said the cartels in Tierra Caliente demanded protection payments from parish priests in the region, and that priests who refused to provide quick baptisms, marriages, or blessings for drug traffickers and their families faced threats, and sometimes worse. There was an instance he referenced of a priest who had been briefly kidnapped by Guerreros Unidos gunmen in the mountains above San Miguel Totolapan, specifically because the cartel believed the priest had been preaching in favor of La Familia Michoacana, one of their rivals. The priest had to explain, under duress, that he had not been preaching about a cartel. He had been preaching about family values, using the Spanish word familia in its ordinary sense. The gunmen released him when they accepted this explanation. The episode, which the bishop cited as an example of how dangerous even a misunderstood sermon could become in Guerrero's cartel landscape, illustrated exactly how completely the boundary between pastoral ministry and cartel politics had dissolved in that region by 2014. Father José Acuña Ascensión Osorio was kidnapped on the afternoon of September 21, 2014, in San Miguel Totolapan. Two unknown individuals forced him into a taxi. The details of what followed are sparse, because the Guerrero state government provided almost nothing in the way of updates or investigation results in the weeks that followed his disappearance, and because the residents of San Miguel Totolapan, who knew him and knew what had happened, were too afraid to speak openly to reporters. The town was controlled by the Guerreros Unidos, talking to journalists about what happened to a priest, or about who operated in the area, or about what the cartel did and did not approve of, was exactly the kind of behavior that brought down consequences on ordinary people in communities where the cartel functioned as the actual authority. So when reporters arrived asking questions, residents described Father Acuña Osorio as well-liked and then said very little more. His body was found in September, floating in the Balsas River near his parish. The Balsas is one of the major rivers of southern Mexico, running through Guerrero and Michoacán on its way to the Pacific, and its presence in the coverage of Father Acuña Osorio's death connects to a pattern that has appeared in Guerrero repeatedly across the cases documented in this script. Bodies found in rivers, in roads, in mass graves, in places far from where the person was last seen, with the geography of their death serving as part of the message. Guerrero's state prosecutors confirmed that the priest's body had head wounds when recovered. They added, with the kind of bureaucratic ambiguity that characterized official communications in Guerrero throughout 2014, that it was unclear whether the wounds had been caused by the body being dragged through the current of the river or whether he had been killed before being dumped in the water. Neither version required acknowledgement that a human being had made a deliberate decision to kill a priest and dispose of his body in a river. Both versions kept the event inside the frame of something that needed more investigation before the most obvious conclusion could be stated plainly. Authorities said they never offered more information on the investigation into his death. That phrase, "never offered more information," is almost a placeholder for justice in Guerrero's clerical murder cases from 2014. It describes what happened with Father Señondo's case at the institutional level before his remains were found through accident during the student search. It describes what happened with Father Lopez Gorostieta's case. It describes what happened with the majority of priest killings in the Diocese of Altamirano across that period. The Diocese of Altamirano itself, speaking through Bishop Martinez and through the vicar who managed communications, expressed the view that there was little likelihood authorities would find the killers, citing the pattern established by previous cases in which nothing had been found and no one had been held accountable. The motive for Father Acuna Osorio's kidnapping and killing was not publicly established through any official investigation. The diocese believed the cartel was responsible, as it believed the cartel was responsible for the other deaths in the area that year. The Guerreros Unidos were the dominant criminal force in San Miguel Totolapan. They were also, by September of 2014, the organization being implicated across every major piece of reporting coming out of Guerrero because of the disappearance of 43 students from the Ayotzinapa Teachers College in Iguala 3 days after Father Acuna Osorio's body was found. On September 26, 2014, Iguala's municipal police, acting under orders from the local mayor, stopped the students' buses and handed the young men over to the Guerreros Unidos, who, according to the official account, killed them and destroyed their remains. The cartel's name, which had existed in security reporting for years, suddenly became synonymous internationally with what many described as one of the worst human rights atrocities in Mexico's modern history. Father Acuna Osorio's death was swallowed in the wave of that larger catastrophe, absorbed into the background noise of a state that was generating more grief than any single newspaper cycle could hold. There are things known about Father Acuna Osorio, and things that will almost certainly never be known. What is known, he was the parish priest of San Miguel Totolapan, a town that by September 2014 was one of the most violently controlled communities in all of Guerrero. He was kidnapped from that town on September 21st by two people who put him in a taxi and drove away. His body was recovered from the Balsas River days later with head wounds and signs consistent with a violent death. No arrests were ever made. No charges were filed. The investigation produced no public results. His diocese mourned him and continued. What is not known, why specifically he was targeted, whether the killing was ordered because he had refused to pay a cartel extortion demand, because he had said something in a sermon that reached the wrong ears, because he represented an obstacle to whatever the Guerreros Unidos needed from his community at that moment, or because he was simply a priest in a place where the cartel had decided priests needed to understand who was in charge. The silence around the motive is itself a form of institutional violence, because it allows the killing to remain unmoored from the decisions someone made to carry it out. Father Acuna Osorio was one of 5 clergy killed in Mexico in 2014, out of 26 reported worldwide that year, making Mexico responsible for nearly a fifth of all clergy deaths globally in that single year. His death, along with those of Father Señondo and Father Lopez Gorostieta in the same diocese, made 2014 the single most devastating year for the Diocese of Altamirano in its recorded history. Monsignor Reyes, who managed the diocese and who spoke to reporters from the National Catholic Register in the months that followed, said plainly that it was obviously a difficult year. The cartels hadn't publicly taken responsibility for the killings, he acknowledged, but the diocese believed all 3 men had been killed by drug cartel organizations. The cartel logic that drove those killings was not complicated. In a region where an organization like Guerreros Unidos operated by extracting money and compliance from everyone within its territory, a priest who said no, in whatever form that refusal took, was not simply being difficult. He was setting an example the organization could not afford to allow to stand. 3 priests in 1 year, in one small diocese, said enough about what was being asked of them and what happened when the answer was the wrong one, that further elaboration from a cartel that had never spoken publicly about any of it was beside the point. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.